Release that witch eye by Ermu. Chapter 101 The Ancient Book and the Traces It Gives, Part 2. What does this mean? Roland rubbed his fingers over the handwritten line. Had the original owner of this ancient book also had to fight against those monsters in the wildlands? He turned his view further down and continued reading. The devils grew each day in number, but every day we became less. God's stone of retaliation was also unable to stop them. It would only work against their unparalleled strange powers, but even without relying on their magic, they were still fierce and terrible enemies. The holy city of Tequila has already fallen into the enemy's hands. The only option left to us was to scatter in all directions. Over the mountains, across the rivers. Trying to flee as far away from the gates of hell as possible. But for the next time, where to should we flee? But, this isn't something I have to think about. I am going to die, Natalia. The devil's power is corroding my body, and every one of our drugs are malfunction. I'm writing all this down because I have a simple matter I want to request of you to do for me. Alice's test of the God's punishment army is already approaching its end, and the test was a success. Even when facing the extraordinary devil warriors they have nothing to fear, but she forgot the important point: even if the God's punishment army will win, this victory won't belong to us. That's right. The God's punishment army will lead to our end. To stop her, only you are left. The text he managed to read wasn't long. Roland swept his gaze once more from beginning to end. He then closed his eyes and began to think about what he had read. Trying to see it from Kara's perspective. Assuming that she wasn't aware of the existence of the devils. And she thought the devil to refer to a witch. Using this assumption, it would be easy to imagine that the book was written from the perspective of a member of the church, fleeing from the witches. Then combined with widely circulated rumors, after all, the rumors say that the witches are all the devil's minions, and that they gained their magic from the gate of hell. Kara most likely thought that the church actually wanted to hide the truth, that they changed the entry to the holy mountain to the gate of hell, and that for several hundreds of years, witches already had access to the holy mountain, and that they found there an eternal life. So the witches became more and more, yet the warriors of the church became less and less. Of course, this theory had many holes to it. For example, the author of the text said that the other side possessed strange powers when compared to ordinary people. Clearly there were no witches who possessed these characteristics. Another example was that even under the suppression of the God's stone of retaliation, the witches were still able to let the church suffer a crushing defeat, which seemed too bizarre. So in the end, the reason why Kara went on the journey to the wildlands was still unknown. Maybe she had just been so eager that she didn't realize that it had already affected her judgment. There was still some content that he wasn't able to understand. Maybe the real cause stood therein? Roland preferred the latter possibility. At least he knew now that the devil that was described on the last page wasn't a witch, but was the description of the real alien race. But all this didn't reduce his doubts, instead it only has increased his already numerous problems. In the end, since when was the church fighting against the devils? Even so, again and again Roland went through the content of the book, but he was still unable to find the relevant content. The church had established their base in the north since the end of the War of Faith. The base was built to defend against the huge gap in the impassable mountain range against the demonic beasts. Later, they simply built a fortress on the plateau of the Hermes, and simply called it the New Holy City. These two cities are now connected together, one on the high ground and the other was low-lying, but both were used to withstand the demonic beast's attack and not the devil's. Besides, he had never heard before of a place called Tequila. If all of this was true, the church would have no reason to hide it. According to church's history books, they were always able to resist the attacks from the demonic beasts, and were also able to achieve great victories in their battle against the witches. This was all described in great detail as if they feared that anyone would forget of their great merits. But compared with the confrontation against the devils, how can they still treat the matter of the demonic beasts and the witches to be more worthy to particularize? The last question concerned the God's punishment army. Evidently this member of the church didn't want to see the God's punishment army to appear. Furthermore, they even entrusted others to stop the person in charge of the experiment. Apparently, they seemed to have succeeded. Roland only knew that the church had an army of judges, but he had never heard of the God's punishment army. Of course, that doesn't rule out that the former fourth prince was simply just ignorant. However, if they really could foster warriors strong enough to fight against the devils, wouldn't it just increase the power of the church? So why would the author of the note write that it would cause their destruction? The place where they found this book should have additional information. It was Kara who found the book. Do you know where she found it? Roland raised his head and asked Nightingale. When I joined the Witch Cooperation Association, the sisterhood had already set foot on the road towards the Holy Mountain. Nightingale, who was still chewing the dried fish, answered absently. But Wendy had mentioned that at the beginning the sisterhood didn't call themselves the Witch Cooperation Association, they were just a couple of witches from the Seawind region. Also among them were Kara, Wendy, and Scroll. Afterwards, when they left the Seawind region, they found a secret meeting place within a forest. But no one had expected that there would actually be a secret entry to an ancient ruin hidden there. She took another bite from her snack, licked her lips and then continued, but except for Kara, no one else had went down to explore it. Did she find the ancient book within the ruins? At least, that's what Kara said. Nightingale curled her lips. And later then, they began to gather more and more witches. But it seems that their hiding place accidentally got leaked to the church, which later then brought a large army to surround the meeting place. Only 20 witches were able to escape, which was less than half of them. It was then that Kara decided to search for the Holy Mountain. So they established the Witch Cooperation Association, with the goal of finding the Holy Mountain as their highest priority. After hearing this story, he once more began to think about it. To study mysteries while knowing so little was just too inconvenient, even more so when it was history mixed with legends, leaving a blank in his mind. The ancient book didn't mention the year that it was written, and there was also no other big war mentioned in other history books he had read. The first person involved in discovering it was already dead, but maybe we can go to find the ancient ruin ourselves, he thought. But to Roland it was also clear that it was basically an impossible task. The forest in the east was just too far away from Border Town. It was much more than just a short walk, it was a journey across the whole kingdom of Grey Castle. But at this moment the development of his territory was his highest priority. Roland stood up and walked to the window. There he had a perfect view over the back gardens. In the garden, the witches were training according to his training program. Now that his group of witches had grown to 12, it was finally time to set up an organization. In his conception, the organization didn't need any program or guideline. It was just designed to facilitate the management of the witches and the ability they were able to wield. Its function would be similar to the future generation of industrial associations. The rules of the organizations would also be as simple as possible. There would only be 2 rules: do not take advantage of your ability to violate the law of the territory. And, it is forbidden to use your ability to evade the law. At the beginning Roland wanted to use the 3 laws of robotics, restricting the ability of the witches by not allowing them to injure or attack ordinary people and so on, but then he thought that it would actually be unnecessary. Their ability was just the same as guns. When confronted with hazards, there was really no difference between using a gun or a witch's ability to defend themselves. And by deliberately stressing the difference between witches and ordinary people, the gap between these 2 groups would only grow further apart. So it wouldn't become illegal. He couldn't avoid his responsibility as a scientist and engineering dog. He had to express himself in the most concise way. As for the name of this organization, Roland had already long ago found a good one. The name of the new collective will be Witch Union. Chapter 102: The Honeysuckle and the Elk Families, Part 1. After nightfall, the Elk Mansion was brightly lit. While holding his invitation, Petrov was welcomed into the hall. The banquet to celebrate the birthday of the 3rd young lady of the Elk family, Aurelia, had just begun. Only people with a prestigious or aristocratic background in Longsong Stronghold were allowed to attend the banquet. As for the Count himself, the birthday banquet was also very important. A woolen carpet was spread throughout the whole hall and all the chamberlains wore a custom-made uniform so that they would easily be recognized. After all, it was Aurelia's 16th birthday, which means that she reached the marriageable age. String music sounded throughout the hall, and attendants were walking in the crowd and handing out glasses of wine. The steaming food was placed on circular tables which were spread within the hall. Aurelia, the protagonist of the birthday banquet, was wearing a canary dress and stood in a corner of the hall surrounded by a group of friends, seeming to be having a very lively chat with them. This was a new popular trend to celebrate, directly coming from the king's city. Previously the banquets were held like this. Usually, there was a long wooden table placed in the hall and all the guests were sitting at the table, waiting for the chef to serve the meal. Then huge bowls with pork and whole chickens was served with butter and bread. In addition, there was also double-sided fried eggs served together with a large pot of lettuce leaves. But some years ago the king came up with a new way to celebrate, and today this was now a mimic of the new style but only in form. For example, the glasses given out were all made of different colors, instead of the normally transparent glasses. Within them, the wine was unable to bring out its mellow color. The circular tables are also covered with white tablecloths, rather than the greasy tablecloths they had used. As for the cooked food, the Elk family was still serving the old Western style, very greasy and coarse. Seeing this, Petrov shook his head. The cook could at least have cut the meat into several small pieces. As usual, Petrov had already filled his stomach at home in advance, since he didn't want to cut the big pieces of meat like a surgeon. He was invited to this birthday party as the representative of his family, so he had to eat at least a mouthful of this oily food, even if it was only to save face. After all, Petrov didn't want to become a joke for the ladies. Long time no seen, man. Suddenly his neck was hooked by someone from behind. I heard you've been appointed as the Duke's messenger? How was the harvest of ore in Border Town? Were you able to steal a lot from them? Hearing this familiar voice, Petrov immediately knew that it was René, the second son of the Elk family, who was bent on becoming a knight, even though there wasn't any territory for him to manage. Such an idiot. As a friend, René would count as not bad, but Petrov still didn't want to speak about what he had encountered in Border Town. So he changed the topic. Shouldn't you be in the camp at the Cold Wind Mountain Range at this moment? I thought you were sitting in a tavern and trembling. Damn, René pushed Petrov away. It seems your mouth is unable to speak a single word of praise. This time I wasn't even able to enter the new holy city. The day before the departure for the border guard, I got infected with a cold and had to lie for a whole week in bed. Good, you seem to have improved compared to the last time, but skipping the journey saved the guards a lot of inconvenience. This time you're wrong, René said suddenly, while a mysterious smile spread over his face. If I hadn't been lying in bed for a week because of the cold, I'd now be lying on the icy walls of the new holy city forever. What do you mean? Petrov raised his eyebrows in confusion. Listen, I have something to tell you. René, the second son of the Elk family, came close to Petrov's ear and whispered. The new holy city almost fell. The demonic beasts were even able to rush into the inner city. If not for the church's timing to release their strongest warriors, they would have been unable to hold the city. But during the fight, the armies of the four kingdoms had suffered heavy losses. Only a few soldiers of the Cold Wind Mountain Range were able to come back alive. In just a month, there are many wives who had become widows, without any savings. He winked his eyes, then stretched out 2 fingers, and now they will get 2 silver royals as compensation. Hey, don't use that look on me, I can't do anything about it. Are you sure this news is true? What happened to the border guards? Of course, I've seen it with my own eyes. When the Lord received the news, he fell ill. René shrugged. As for the guards, what else could they do, instead of slowly recruiting new guards? Now the North is desperately in need of experienced soldiers. If not for my call to come home, I would be commanding a cavalry squad right now. That isn't the important point, Petrov thought to himself. The border guards from the Cold Wind Mountain Range was also the primary defense against the church's army of judges. Now the generals and soldiers of the Four Kingdom are buried at the Hermes. If that doesn't taste a little bit of a conspiracy, then I don't know what does. If they plotted to attack us, the north of the kingdom of Grey Castle, which is now like a nearly stripped bare woman, how many soldiers are lost in the army of judges? They didn't fare much better than the other 4 armies. Think about it, they always rush to the front like fanatics. On the other hand, if the army of judges didn't attack, the soldiers of the other four kingdoms certainly wouldn't have moved, Renee said in disdain. Knights shouldn't be like this, always speaking about honor, but when they have to confront demonic beasts, shrinking back like little girls. You mean knights like the one in front of me now? Perrault smiled. Perhaps I'm just thinking too much into this. Even if the church wants to start a war against the north, it will have nothing to do with us here in Longsong Stronghold. Should the new king get headaches from thinking about this? Unfortunately, until now, no one has accepted my allegiance, or, perhaps they just don't have the qualification to take me in. Renee paused, looked towards the door. The people of the wolf family have come, I'm just going to greet them, and then I'll come back. Go, but don't come back. Oh, that's right, Renee retorted as he looked back. Have you noticed the handkerchief in the invitation? Were you the one that put it in? Petrov asked. Oh, if it was me, I'd only have given you some 2-days-old socks. Renee shook his finger. That was my younger sister's personal decision. Although the age gap is rather big, but as long as you have the intention, I can only say that you shouldn't wait, my friend. After all, you're already 22 years old by now. Petrov gave him a dirty look, but Renee just whistled innocently, then turned around and laughingly went away. After taking a glass of wine from an attendant, Petrov strolled by himself to the corner, while quietly looking through the lively hall. He noticed that Aurelia was still busy talking lively with her friends. But at the very same time as himself, she also took a secret look at himself, so that for a short moment, their eyes met. But immediately afterwards Petrov saw that Aurelia quickly changed her line of sight and on her cheeks emerged a touch of red of embarrassment. Petrov in return just smiled kindly. In his view, the other was just a little girl. All of a sudden, the sounds of a fierce discussion came from the other side of the hall, attracting the eyes of all the people present. What? He dared to say that? Yes. Cornelius, that coward, unexpectedly didn't even dare to let out a fart. He just came back with his tail between his legs, said the man with the loudest voice, shaming the whole of Longsong Stronghold. Petrov knew the man. If he remembered correctly, he was called Simon Elliot, a member of the Wolf Branch family, who was also married to a very pretty woman. Petrov had seen the woman once. She really was charming. It seems as if you have a way to solve the problem. Someone teased. I may not be able to do it alone, but if you can get the Duke to notice of this ridiculous affair, I don't believe Roland Wimbledon would still dare to act so rampant any longer. Hearing the familiar name, Petrov was startled and started to follow the conversation, fully interested. Chapter 103: The Honeysuckle and the Elk Families, Part 2. What happened? Petrov went through the crowd and asked. Sir Hull, they were talking about the Lord of Border Town, answered someone that had seen the honeysuckle crest on his chest. He has confiscated all the belongings of our people from Longsong Stronghold. You can call me Petrov. Tell me about the situation, Petrov ordered. Let me explain it to you, Mr. Petrov, Simon said while pressing through the crowd, revealing a pleasing smile. This is how it is. We served the Duke with our lives, so I lived in the border town where I was responsible for managing the mines. Every winter we will take the town's residents back with us to the Longsong Stronghold, where we are able to protect them from the demon beast's attack. But this year, after the end of the months of the demons, when one of my colleagues, Cornelius Fletcher, came back to Border Town, the Lord told him that his house has been demolished by the townspeople and that he wouldn't receive any compensation for it. If you don't admit that the house didn't belong to you, I will put you in prison for desertion, where you will wait for the day of your hanging, he said, exactly copying the fourth prince's words. Sir, you have to understand, what he called defection, is the procedure we have used for over 100 years. Petrov couldn't stop himself from imaging the young man's appearance in his mind. Although to the outside world the prince was extremely unbearable, but compared with his personal experience of their 2 meetings, Roland Wimbledon was no pushover. Also, his method of handling the crime of defection hit the nail on the head. However, the other side didn't try to think the matter through and was only looking for a reason, but the prince never thought to convince the group of people with reason. He has already broken away from Longsong Stronghold long ago, Petrov thought. Or, when he thought about it further, How can it be that the prince never knew that the nobility would seek refuge in Longsong's stronghold? Obviously, that isn't possible. He clearly knew, yet he still forced a criminal charge upon them, forcing the other side to make a choice. But in the end, he still let the other party come back to Longsong's stronghold to report such a barbaric act. In the end, what is it that the prince wants to achieve? But he is still the lord of Border Town, said the man who Simon previous laughed at. As the lord, he has the power to dictate the rules within his own land. Border Town still belongs under the jurisdiction of the Western Territory. Simon retorted, unhappy with a cold voice, do you question the authority of Duke Ryan? As the Duke, it's his job to supervise the mine, and he appointed the nobles to do it in his name. But now Roland had taken all the houses of the nobility for himself, which is openly pitting himself against the 6 families. Duke Ryan will never stand by and only look as he does as he pleases. You're speaking about the man who hanged Dmitri Hill? Petrov didn't know when Renee came over. My father has been furious. Young lord, Simon said, greeting him with a salute, it is exactly that man, and now he is behaving even more wildly. I'm afraid that only Duke Ryan can stop the prince, and I hope that you will convey this issue to the Duke. Don't worry, even with or without this matter, Duke Ryan is already prepared to play his cards. Renee seemed not the least bit concerned about the future. It is for exactly this matter that I've come back. It is just that at this moment my eldest brother is still in the king's city setting his name under a trade contract, so at the moment only I can lead the Elk family. Really? That's great, Simon said happily. Petrov frowned. He himself knew that since the moment he came to deliver the trade offer and the prince chose to stay for the winter in Border Town, that such a day would come sooner or later. But he had never expected that his own friend would be fighting in this battle. Despite all the onlooking eyes, he pulled Renee directly to his side, trying to discourage him. You shouldn't go to battle, that is a prince you're fighting. I know he is a prince, the prince of the mountain. Renee patted on Petrov's shoulders. Rest assured, Duke Ryan will not hurt the prince, maybe just as in the past he will surrender when he meets resistance. Even if he wants to resist, as long as we launch an attack on our horses, those farmers and miners will scatter. The 4th prince has never brandished a sword or spear. I think he won't even manage to cut a hair. No, I was worried that you would be hurt by him. But he was unable to say it. He knew that the others would never believe him, because even for himself it was still difficult to believe. The prince can only rely on farmers and miners, while the duke can rely on knights. I do not know why, but my heart becomes uneasy when I think about it. Master Petrov, your father called for you. He has something to discuss with you. A white-haired steward suddenly rushed to the side of Petrov and talked into his ear. I've got it, Petrov nodded, and after an early goodbye to Renee, he took a coach back to the house of honeysuckle with his housekeeper. Father, he entered the study and saw his father Shalafi Hull writing something by the table. When he heard Paul's voice, the count did not pause his writing. You have to sum up the number of people and their income within our domain and deliver your summary to me. I will then arrange the soldiers for the spring expedition. Duke Ryan has already sent out his call for weapons. When the snow melts, we and the other 5 families have to provide him with knights and mercenary, which will then march against Border Town. How much do we have to provide? The count put the pen down and raised his head. What happened? Until now you have never concerned yourself with this kind of problem. He reached to the side of the table and opened a letter. We have to send at least 25 knights, together with their corresponding squires and horses. Also for the mercenaries, they must be fully equipped, and lastly we have to send 100 free people or serfs, who have to be equipped with simple weapons. Petrov summed up the troops within his head. If I add all the soldiers provided by the 5 families, we will provide more than 1,000 soldiers. Together with the Duke's own troops, it will add up to a force able to sweep away any power in the Western Territory. Even if the Longsong stronghold didn't send there defending troops, this force isn't something that Border Town can resist. After all, Border Town only has 2,000 inhabitants. Father, can you please stay away from the battlefield? Petrov asked hesitantly. What do you want to say, son? The count asked strangely. I'm worried about your safety. His Royal Highness only has a few knights and less than 50 guards. Our numbers are more than 10 times greater than his. Theoretically, this was the case, but his father had never seen the prince before, but Petrov did. But, "Father," everybody said, that the wall made up out of mud paste will soon collapse, but the prince presided over the construction and it still stands. They also said that border town using only miners and farmers as soldiers cannot stop the demonic beasts. His Royal Highness has not only done this, he was even able to defend his town until the end of the demons of the months, and during the whole months, no one fled from border town. The more he said the more disturbed his heart became. Now, once more, everyone thinks that Duke Ryan will defeat Roland Wimbledon, running over the prince as easily as running over an ant. "Father, are you certain that it will be as easy as you think?" "That's enough." Shalafi slammed his fist onto the table. He shook his head and stood up, then he went to the wall on which the portraits of their ancestor hung. "You always liked more to be a businessman and buy and sell goods than riding a horse and going to war. This is fine for me. But being a merchant is not equal to being a coward. Those merchants who crossed the ocean were threatened with death every day," he shouted, pointing at the wall. "Look at the portraits, your grandfather, your grandfather's grandfather, they all leaned on their longbow or their sword and defended themselves against demon beasts, bandits, and brigands. You disappoint me, being so afraid of fighting." "No, father." Petrov bowed his head, no longer motivated to argue, but within his heart he thought, "You are talking about grandfather and grandfather's father, but if you took a closer look at those powerful faces, and then take a look at your loose belt and your overflowing double chin. Father, do you really believe you are able to use the bow?" Chapter 104 Planning and Entertainment. On a sunny afternoon, it was finally time for Roland to fulfill his promises. He conferred the title of Viscount to Sir Payne. In addition to the title, he also received a territory to the south of the Cherchouet River and the right to set up a small village on the other side of the river. Currently, this new territory was still covered by jungle, but Roland had already planned to develop the land. In order to make him give up the autonomy of his newly acquired territory, Roland promised Sir Payne that he would give priority in opening up the territory as soon as possible. Furthermore, on the open ground Roland would also establish several different kinds of industries that would generate shares to be given to Sir Payne and his descendants. Roland, of course, used his technical abilities as the reason to describe why it was needed for him to supervise the industries. He also explained to him that it was a pretty good possibility to receive money without having to do anything. Sir Payne readily agreed to this offer. After all, he didn't like this kind of work. In his view, there was nothing more interesting than riding a horse into battle. But after he had his daughter, he instead put his focus into hunting. The industries in his old territory had already long since been ruined, so he simply asked Roland to help him sell his land, which was located east of Longsong Stronghold, after all his family had already completely moved and started to live in border town. Roland naturally agreed to his request. Another person he conferred a title to was Brian, who was awarded with a knighthood. Afterward Brian had to choose if he wanted to get his own territory or still wanted to serve in the army. If he chose the land, then he could no longer serve in border town's first army. If he decided to join the army, he had to, just like the others, receive his land due to the achievement of his military merits. Without any hesitation, Brian chose the latter option. As a result, Roland could finally start with planning the general layout of his territory. With the Cherchouet River as one boundary, and the impassable mountain range as the other. The living area had a length of 3 kilometers and a width of 7 to 8 kilometers. After the construction of the residential areas, it could also later be used as a prize, which could be given as an additional reward to promoted officers. The other side of the Cherchouet River will become the future industrial areas and agricultural areas. The land could be extended to the south, but the only problem was that it was still covered by forest. In addition, its topography sloped higher and lower in the further distances. To meet the needs of the population, Roland must begin to reclaim the land. The border area to the west of the garrison and the forest where the demonic beasts hid themselves were also important areas to open up. The forest has a wide range of treasures, such as wood, edible fungi, wild animals, herbs, and more. In addition to using wood for construction and in industry, it could also be used as a fuel source. The vast area covered by the forest was staggering. Roland had already sent lighting to explore it, but even flying more than 30 kilometers she still hadn't been able to see its end. That meant that if all of the wood in the forest was to be used for building a fire, it would burn for a very long time. The last area was the territory between the hiding forest and the impassable mountain range. It was a no man's land, a restricted area, in other words, a barbarian wasteland. He could only speculate how big the area between the impassable mountain range and the border of the forest was. Both borders were extremely vast. It had to be much bigger than the territory of the Kingdom of Grey Castle. In the face of such an extremely large and ownerless land, Roland's heart began to itch. But he also knew that for the moment he was temporarily unable to bother himself with this piece of land. At present, the most important thing for Border Town was to increase its population. Back in his office at the castle, he called for the artist Soraya. "How was your work? Are you still helping out in the town hall?" "I have never painted so many paintings in one day." She seemed to be in a much better condition than the last time he had seen her. "Today I have already finished the basic pictures, but only painting pictures of their heads while looking through a window feels a little strange." "They would easily become scared when they see your magic pen," the prince smiled. "They know that there are witches in Border Town, but if you get in close contact with them, it could easily cause accidents, so we just took some simple hidden measures, not letting them know that you are a witch. Later their opinion will slowly start to change." Soraya's photographic ability helped to bring Roland's citizenship registration program to a new level. For this plan, he had emptied a room in the town hall and then used the room to store the information about the town's citizens. It was similar to a population register. On each piece of paper were written their names, ages, addresses, blood relatives, and so on. This information was all the statistics he had gathered during the winter, and now the records were expanded with new content. The biggest change to all of their personal accounts was that he added to each of them a color photo. According to Roland's request, the town hall had set up a small room large enough for one person that was enterable without being seen. It had only a small window through which Soraya could see the face of the person she should paint. So when she painted the portrait of her subject, the other person couldn't see her using her magic pen. As to how it was possible for him to let the town's residents come over and give their personal information so freely, Roland's method was very simple. Whoever came over and gave their information got 10 copper royals. He ordered the town hall to allocate the money. "Today I called you here to draw something else." Roland took out some cutout papers and gave them to Soraya. The latter noted that the sizes of those pieces of papers were exactly the same, with a size of half a palm, and in a rectangular format. "What do you want me to paint?" "Some props for entertainment," Roland said. He had this idea within his mind for a long time already. Every day the witches had nothing to do besides practicing their magic. This life had to be a bit boring. The same could be said for the prince, especially when he had to wait for the moment the snow finally melted. Until then he was stuck within the castle. Therefore, he came up with the idea of reinventing some games from his old word and finding a way for the witches to relax. The simplest possibility was to create a card game. But the soft ordinary paper he had wasn't suitable for card games. Shuffling was also a hassle. However, with Soraya, he could finally make some more advanced things. Entertainment? She crouched her head, wondering what kind of entertainment she was painting on a square piece of paper. "Okay, you have the final say. First, on this piece of paper, you have to draw a soldier with a heavy crossbow. Imagine? Yes, the armor, the body shape, age, and the surroundings, everything up to you to freely imagine, as long as it has a heavy crossbow." I will try it." Soraya closed her eyes, meditation for a while, then she summoned her pen into her hand and soon a bright light streamed from her hands onto the paper. Soon, a middle-aged man looking just like a crossbow soldier appeared on the paper. "Very well," Roland praised. "Let me think about what the next painting should be." In the upper left corner of the paper and the middle position, draw a small circle at each of these positions. He recalled the card in his head. The first circle is white in the center with a golden coating, and the second one has an orange color together with a golden coating, he said. When the circles were finished, Roland let her add a number to the first circle, and to the second circle you will add a bow and an arrow mark into the circle. The beauty of Soraya's ability lied in her ability to ignore the material she had to paint on. It didn't matter to her if it was a blank sheet of paper or an already painted piece. The second design can perfectly cover the former painting, like a layered mask. Thus, a delicate crossbow card appeared in front of Roland. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. "This is just the card of one unit, there are still many similar cards waiting to be painted by you. By the end, you will get a deck and then I'll teach you how to play." When looking at Soraya, who was painting with her eyes closed, Roland felt a kind of hunch from his heart. Perhaps soon a dialogue like this would be heard within the castle. "Do you have anything important to do? If not, let us first play a round of Gwent." Chapter 105 Army Marching Song. Echo was sitting on the highest point of the castle, on the roof of the watchtower, from where she was able to overlook the whole town. She was only able to reach the top thanks to Lightning taking her up on a piggyback ride. Now she had to stay here until sunset, only then would the little girl come back and take her back down. At the moment, Lightning should have already been on her way to the Longsong stronghold. The weather was very good today, the sun was shining brightly, and the river in the distance looked under the sunlight like it was made of satin, slowly flowing westwards and dividing the green leaves on the one side and the snowy landscape on the other side into two sides. Lying comfortably in the sun, she felt as if her whole body was embraced warmly by the sun. It was completely unlike her previous time in the extreme south, where the scorching sunlight was so aggressive that it easily hurt her skin. Even the wind isn't the same, she thought. During my life I've already felt 6 different kinds of wind. The slightly salty sea breeze in Port of Clearwater, while in King City I felt the wind of the hot and damp monsoons. During my travel through the impassable mountain range we were constantly accompanied by the freezing cold north wind. And now, here in Border Town, the light breeze has an earthly aroma to it. No matter what, the wind here is pure and independent. In the Irons End city, it was either so hot that there was no wind, or we would have an overwhelming storm. Then the wind became visible and the storming air mixes with the stones and gravel. From afar it looked like a giant black monster. Every time the wind came up, I had to hide inside a house or any place else which wasn't in the open. There was nothing that was able to stop the wind. Echo still wanted to throw up. And taking her revenge when she thought about her past, it was nearly 4 years ago that she left Irons End City. Her Osha clan, unfortunately, was defeated during a fight for power, her father killed by their enemy even after he surrendered. Echo, who witnessed all this, wanted to rush to the enemy and take him down by herself, but at that moment she had been caught off guard from behind. She didn't know how many members of her clan were still alive after these 4 years. Before she was sold as a slave to the Port of Clearwater, she heard that her Osha clan had violated the agreements of the sacred duel, and were now spurned by the 3 gods. Who then exiled them to the Endless Cape, never being allowed to return to Irons End City. But Echo knew that it was all a conspiracy by the Tibia clan. They had smeared black oil on their whip, and as long as this oil was ignited, even water was unable to put it out. It was this trick which caught her brother, the clan's strongest warrior, off guard in the duel, so that he was burned alive, leading to the chaos in their team's formation. In the Endless Cape the only thing beside the hot sand were the ever-burning fires of Mother Earth, who was even more maniac than her brother the Emperor of the Sea. Soon the people of her clan would have turned into bones, but in the end, her fate as a slave was even more miserable. When Echo awakened to her power, she knew that she had become a witch. Naturally, she thought about revenge, but in the end her ability was useless, she was only able to release sound. No matter how much she begged the gods, they never heard her prayers. 6 months later, when she was living in the Port of Clearwater, she came to an understanding. The thought that they were loved by the 3 gods was in truth only their self-deception. Under the jurisdiction of the church, the witches were all hunted inside the 4 kingdoms. From that day on, Echo completely gave up on her hope for revenge. At this moment, suddenly a billow of smoke rose from the distance. She looked to the east bank of Shui River and she saw several lights of green flames flash through the trees. The black smoke of the burning trees mixed together with the vapor of the melting snow, forming a gray plume in the sky. It was Anna's green flame. When they arrived for the first time in Border Town, Wendy had briefed the sisters about Anna and Nana. When Echo heard about Anna's ability, she was very envious. Anna was able to freely manipulate flames. It could even reach the temperature hot enough to melt swords. If she had such a powerful ability when she had lived in Irons End City, the people of the Tibia clan would never have been able to hurt them. Echo shook her head. Thoughts like these were totally unnecessary. Most probably her people had already turned into bones. Since she was still alive, she could count herself as lucky. Since His Royal Highness was willing to accept her, she should complete the orders given by His Royal Highness. She cleared her throat and began to hum the song according to the prince's demands. It was a cheerful ditty. The prince had only hummed the melody once, but she completely remembered the whole ditty. Music was nothing new to Echo. As a superior slave, she was taught many things. Seductive dances and flirtatious crooning were skills she'd had to master. But the music given by His Highness was completely differently. It was full of rhythm, full of powerful energy. Especially when he asked her to simulate the sound of a flute, every note was like a pulsing beat. People hearing this couldn't help themselves from wanting to dance. The difficulty lied in playing several instruments at the same time. Later there were also drums and string instruments that were added. So she had to simulate 3 different kinds of sounds at the same time, which overlapped each other. Something like this was something that she had never done before. Previously she would have never believed that music could also be played in this way. In the beginning, it was hard for her to make sure that the drums didn't disrupt the rhythm of the flutes, so Roland gave her the tip to play the beat with her hands or feet, and only later gradually start to fuse the 2 sounds together. After a few days of practice, Echo had gradually mastered this kind of music. After playing it for several times, she was self-assured enough to finally add the string instruments. When Echo played the new melody for the first time, she had to change the notes again a little. If the sound of the cheerful flute were the torso, the heated drums were the bones, and the last seemingly embellished strings were the soul. She increased the beat, over and over again, until the 3 instruments were finally fully integrated. The sound was getting higher and higher until she couldn't stop herself from starting to sing. Asterisk. My attack power is higher than yours, so it's my win. Roland put his last card on the table, and Soraya, who sat across of him, covered her face and said with a low voice, "One more round." Then she thought for a moment, and shuffled through the cards. "Let me pick your 10 cards this time." "Well," coughed the prince, "it's already late, I have still several things to do, you should go to the other." After laying down a groundwork of different cards, the next part was to copy the already invented cards. With the template in front of her, Soraya's speed of drawing was comparable to a printer. Soon, Roland got several copies of the same units. So naturally Soraya became his first opponent. After explaining the rules to her, the first card war was started. During the games, he quickly learned that the thinking process of the witches was completely differently from ordinary people. Soraya quickly figured out the right way to use the skills. After playing for several rounds, Roland was still able to win, but this was only due using several special cards. When Soraya asked him to create her own special cards, he shamefully rejected. "All right," Soraya said, then she took the cards into her arms and ran into the direction of the door. At this moment, a cheerful melody came through the open windows. Hearing this, Soraya paused, turned around and ran to the window, taking a probing look outside. "Is that Echo?" "Well, it looks like she has completely mastered it." Roland leaned back in his chair and admired the familiar music. Border Town's first army would soon enter the first stage of comprehensive maneuvering. Compared with the training for shooting while standing on the wall, the comprehensive maneuvering would be carried out in the wild. At the same time that they moved through the wild, they had to hold their formation, always forming a shooting line. In order to make the soldiers march with the same pace, he had to rely on drums and slogans. But now with Echo, he could simulate several instruments at the same time. Now they had only had to simply to learn English, then they could implement several famous marching sounds. Compared to the simple drums, the marching song would not only control the marching speed, it would also effectively boost morale. Of course, the most famous marching song was the British Grenadiers, but Roland only knew its name. but he didn't know the full tune. But this didn't pose a problem for him. As long as he had the tune to the British Grenadiers, he could always rearrange its lines later. During the War of Resistance, the sound could be heard through the whole nation, north and south of the Yangtze River. And nearly everyone was familiar with its melody. After all, it was the famous guerrilla song. When Soraya turned her head in the direction of the prince, she heard the prince following the song, gently singing. He sang in a language she had never heard before, but still, the melody and the lyric fitted together perfectly. We are all sharpshooters. Each bullet takes out an enemy. We are all soldiers with wings. Unafraid of tall mountains and deep waters. In the dense forests, our comrades set their camps. On the tall mountains, our countless brothers are there. Chapter 106. It's not the same for him. When Scroll knocked on the door, she quickly heard an answer from the other side. Please enter. Hearing this, she pushed open the door and stepped into the room. Within the room she saw Anna sitting at her table in front of the window, busy reading a thick book. The sunlight was flooding the room through the window, stretching the woman's silhouette until it was unusually long. Within the sun her soft cheeks and neck were dazzlingly white, and her shoulder-covering flaxen hair seemed to be made of white gold. After nearly a week of living together, Scroll had a basically understanding of Anna's temperament. For example, if she had something to say she would speak bluntly and never equivocate. She was calm and quiet, especially studious. In short, it was difficult to find any other civilian-born person like Anna who was totally at peace with herself. How is it that you aren't playing that card game? Scroll took a chair and placed it next to Anna. During the last 2 days, whenever her sisters had finished their daily practice, they would immediately rush back to the castle, crowding Soraya's room, playing the so-called Gwent card game and competing against each other to collect more cards. It seemed like they would never get tired of this. She even saw that Anna and Nana played this game every day after they learned the rules. There were only rare occasions where they didn't play. Unlike the previous days, she would often see the young girl with the healing powers coming to the castle to play. I just wanted to read some books. Anna turned to the next page. Since I don't have your ability, I have to spend more time to read the books. Anna almost read everything, from historical biographies to long poems, including every book she saw on the streets, even if it was only a variety of folk tales. As long as they were collected into a book, she would read them with relish. Scroll touched her head sympathetically. Don't worry. Remind me that I wanted to give you a new book to read. It was only because of her that the fate of us survivors of the Witch Cooperation Association had so greatly changed, Scroll thought. If it wasn't for her, Nightingale would never have left halfway for the direction of Border Town. So we would never have met the 4th Prince of Kingdom of Greycastle, and so would never have come to know the method to staying healthy. In a sense, she was the savior to all witches. Which was also the reason why Scroll had from the beginning felt only goodwill for Anna, while the latter also quickly accepted the other witch who had so much knowledge and experience. But it was also clear that Anna greatly envied Scroll for her ability, which in return to Scroll was a little ridiculous. In the Witch Cooperation Association, the sisters never showed any envy for another witch's abilities. It was even more ridiculous since Anna had the largest magic capacity Nightingale had ever seen a witch possessed before. Furthermore, the ability of her green flame was also one of the strongest. Your hair has become a little long. Anna's curly bangs were nearly covering her eyes. Is there no one who can help you cut them? Anna shook her head. No, I'm all on my own. Suddenly Scroll became totally motivated. Your tangled hair isn't good looking. Let me cut it for you. You do this for me? I've cut the hair of most of the sisters during our time in the camp, Scroll answered happily. Wait a minute, I'll go get the tools. She soon came back while holding a cloth bag. When she spread the bag's content out, Anna saw several white pieces of clothes and a bronze scissor. The scissor was V-shaped, and at both its ends it had many scratches, already losing its gloss and clearly showing that it was well used. Before Scroll had joined the Witch Cooperation Association, the scissors were used to help her cut the hairs of her customers in the Seawind region. All the copper royals she didn't need to buy bread were handed over to an old captain with a broken leg. This captain was the one who'd taught her to read and write until he died of old age. Scroll skillfully put one of the white clothes on Anna's neck, and started cutting her hair. "I had some questions I wanted to ask you," Anna announced. "What do you want to know?" Under her skillful fingers the scissor flew through Anna's hair, always releasing a crisp caca sound. Soon the first cluster of finger-length hair was cut and fell to the ground. "Many of the stories described in the books I'd gotten from you yesterday almost always have the same ending. Will the prince always take a princess as his bride?" Hearing this question, Scroll's hand paused for a moment. The stories in the book were not stories of a real people, instead it was a collection of stories she had heard within her 10 years in the Sea Breeze region. They were stories told to her by the sailors. But Scroll had specifically put this kind of stories together, and every story where the prince wouldn't marry the princess didn't have a happy ending. These kinds of stories were put together in one book and which she then gave to Anna to read. Always knowing that after reading Anna would ask her exactly this question, but now that she really had to answer the question, she hesitated. Most of the time this is the case, of course. Some princes will also marry the daughter of a Grand Duke or a Duke. For example, Greycastle's King Wimbledon III, his wife was the daughter of the Duke of Silver City. Answering the question like this, Scroll suddenly felt very sad. Wendy and Scroll herself had already talked about Nightingale's situation, but compared to the mature and calm Shadow Killer, she was more worried about the possibility that the prince and Anna would develop deeper feeling and become closer. Anna was a woman who was very important to His Royal Highness, and everyone could clearly see this. When Anna and Roland were in the same room, his eyes would always fall on her. Anna's life was several times busier than that of any other sisters. Even more important than that was that even Nightingale had to share her room with Wendy, but His Royal Highness didn't change Anna's room into a double, making her the only one was allowed to have a room all to herself. The reason for this was that when Nana came over to sleep in the castle she could share the room with Anna. He seemed to not realize that he was the owner of this place and that there was no reason that he had to explain himself. And for Anna it was the same case. When she was together with the other witches she was a person of few words, she was even for most of the time just a quiet listener. But when Roland was by her side she would immediately become active. If there was anything which was able to let her forget about her books, Scroll thought that only the prince was able to achieve this. Unfortunately, Roland was the fourth son of the former king of Greycastle, the future king who will support the witches, and Anna was only a witch. Since Roland was a prince, Scroll was unable to order him, so she had no other choice than to influence Anna in the direction she thought would be correct. She didn't want those two to be estranged from each other, but she also didn't want to see it ending in the only possible result, a tragedy. "Why?" asked Anna, shaking her head, as if to try to get the memories of her destroyed dreams out of her head. "Does he have to do this, even though he doesn't like the princess or any other woman of the nobility?" Scroll hadn't thought that she would continue questioning. Even then he had still has to marry them. Because the prince would most likely become the new king and the king's marriage can't be his own personal decision. She tried to recall some of the knowledge from the books that would help her. In order to stabilize the powers within his own country. In order to appease the neighboring countries. In order to achieve a good deal, these are all important reasons for marrying a princess. But the most important matter is that the king has to have heirs. Hearing all this, Anna did not ask any further, which in return made Scroll a little relieved. This kind of thing was something only slowly achieved, not something she could force. But she believed that one day Anna would understand her thoughts. When the trimming came to its end, Scroll scratched the fringes on Anna's shoulder away. "Now, you're looking great." "Thank you," said Anna and bowed thankfully. Well, for today's book, Scroll thought for a moment, then she decided to tell her about the Wolfshark Kingdom's history, trying to reinforce the impression she had installed today, her own selection of the royal family biography. When Scroll was finally ready to leave, Anna suddenly began to speak, still holding the Book of Illusion within her hands. "I think Roland isn't one of those princes from your stories." Her voice was very steady and powerful, nothing as if she was only speaking to convince herself. "He will do whatever he wants to do. His decision won't be influenced by anything else." For a long time Scroll was startled, and in the end, she could only merely ask, "Why?" If he were one of those princes, he would never have saved me. Chapter 107 Asking for his intention. After dinner, Roland returned to his office to continue to copy down all the primary mathematical knowledge from his mind onto paper. He wasn't gifted with an extraordinarily retentive memory, and also not to forget that his memory would decline over time. Because of his former job, he had often used mathematical and physical knowledge to get the job done. But his knowledge about other subjects such as history, geography, biology, chemistry, and the other classes, had in the years degraded back to entry level. Therefore, even if it was a little early, he still wanted to write down all of his knowledge, so that other people could at least learn from it. Each time when he filled up a piece of paper, he gave the letter to Scroll, letting her read it. As long as she saw the content, it was equivalent to permanently preserving his work. Unfortunately, Scroll's ability was only being able to remember everything. Even with all the content, it didn't mean she was able to self-teach herself high school mathematics knowledge. So whenever Roland had time, he would explain to her the knowledge she had previously read. Of course, with regards to lecturing others, Roland liked it very much and thought that it was an interesting job. Especially when he at first saw the confused look on Scroll's face, then when her expression would turn into one of concentration only to suddenly turn into a look filled with realization. Whenever he saw this look, he would feel a sense of accomplishment. However, Roland clearly knew that it also had to do with the target of his lessons. Although Scroll was already nearing the age of 40, but the aging of her face had been greatly slowed by her magic. The skin on her cheeks was still tight and had a healthy touch of red, her hair was tied behind her head, giving her a mature and capable look. The tiny crow's feet in the corner of her eyes didn't damage her overall aesthetic appearance. Instead, it brought out the impression of someone with a stable temperament. If she were to be placed in a movie, she would definitely give off the impression of an elegant and versatile teacher. Now, when he was able to stun this teacher with his knowledge, the sense of contrast felt quite good. Roland was silently asked himself, in the end, what is magic in this world? Magic is everywhere, whether one is in the depths of the northern slope mine or in the impassable mountain range. In the barbarian wasteland west of us or in the east within the sea wind region. A witch would always be able to cast her incredible magic. If I look at the magic to be the same as energy, then the witches are the same as an electrical instrument. But the magic power obviously has many more possibilities to offer than electricity would have. It was more like it was the origin of all energies. For example, Wendy had said that Kara was able to summon 4 different kinds of magical snakes, namely, death, pain, petrification, and nothingness. Each of them had a different kind of venom. Another example was Nightingale. Her ability to enter into the fog would almost distort space. The witch's magical abilities varied so much, that other than being related to the origin of the world, Roland couldn't think of any description more appropriate. To give a definition of the origin, someone has to look at the universe and its rules. In my former world, Einstein determined the 4 fundamental forces of the universe and put them into a theoretical framework, the so-called Grand Unified Theory. In other words, what he did was to find the origin of the universe. In case someone found the rule to the universe, could this rule then be applied in every universe? Coming to this point, Roland couldn't help himself from questioning, if he returned to his former world, would there also be the same power? Yet, because they had no witches who could access this power, the power got just ignored by the people? No matter what, at the moment Roland could only think about it. After all, with the current level of technology, he couldn't analyze this power closer. So promoting the Industrial Revolution and promoting the standard of civilization was the most important work for him. Maybe one day, the power could not only be used by the witches with their direct access to the origin, converting it into a kind of energy that could be used for a variety kind of effects at the same time. Just thinking about it made him feel totally excited. Your Royal Highness? When Scroll saw the prince lost in thoughts with an intoxicated look on his face, she couldn't stop herself from speaking out. Well, Roland said, slowly coming back from his thoughts. After embarrassingly coughing twice, he glanced at the burning candle and told her, that was enough for today, come back tomorrow. Yes, Your Highness, Scroll bowed once, but when she was already on her way leaving the room, she unknowingly slowed her pace. When Roland even after half a minute didn't hear the closing sound of the door, he raised his head in confusion. Seeing that the other one was still standing in the doorway, he asked, "Was there anything else?" "Your Highness," Scroll hesitated for a moment, but then she said, "I want to ask you a question." "Ask freely." Roland nodded and put his quill down and instead raised his cup and drank some tea. There was really no problem with the witches, that was, if someone searched for it, someone could point out that they weren't competent enough. They were just the same as rabbits, slowly sticking their heads out of their hole, always ready to flee back into it even if the grass was only moved by the wind. It would be better if they weren't any longer so afraid and would act more freely. Roland's estimation was that her question would be the usual kind of, "Why are you willing to host us? Aren't you afraid of the threat by the church and the likes?" Nightingale and Wendy had asked him this kind of question so many times that he couldn't count it any longer. But since Scroll was in such an earnest mood, he naturally had to give her a seriously answer, so that they could experience his honest comrade-like treatment, giving them the feeling of being surrounded by a warm spring breeze. "Is it possible that you would ever marry a witch?" Pfft, Roland nearly sprayed the tea out of his mouth. Why would you ask that?" Scroll opened her mouth, but in the end, she was still unable to answer him. To marry a witch? When thinking about this question, the first person appearing within his mind was Anna. From the time he met her in the cage, and he saw her pair of lake-like blue eyes, she had left a deep impression on his heart. Before their awakening, witches are just ordinary human women, but afterwards, their ability made them superior. And the same could be said about the appearance of their body, both were superior to that of an ordinary woman. If he were to place them in modern society, they would definitely become the focus of everyone's attention. So, is there any reason why I should hesitate? That not being the case. He looked at Scroll and replied with a smile, "Why would I not?" Asterisk. On the way back to her room, Wendy rubbed her sore shoulders. "My chest is just too big, it's causing nothing but trouble. Especially when I have to stay on the roof of my small sheet on Little Town. I have to raise my hands when I summon the wind, but when I do, I also have to bend backward, if not I will lose my balance." Compared to the first test trial, Little Town had gotten a number of improvements. For example, she had gotten a simple shed at her workplace, both to block the wind and rain, but also to avoid the sun's exposure. Another improvement was the tree bark, which was now fastened around the hull. It was used to reduce the incoming collision force when landing at port. Also, both sides of the ship were now equipped with 2 cement blocks, to make things easy for fastening the ship with hemp rope. And after nearly a month of training, her ability to control the wind had gotten substantially better. Now, regardless if the ship was stable or not, she could always control the degree of the wind, letting it blow fast or slow. She had also learned to use the already existing wind to adjust her own magic consumption, so that in the end she would be able to summon her wind for a longer period of time. Nightingale, who came home before Wendy, had already finished her bathing and was now sitting in pajamas on the bedside waiting for Wendy's return. But when Wendy saw her, there seemed to be something strange. Nightingale had an irrepressible smile on her face. "What kind of good thing happened to you?" Wendy asked. But the latter shook her head without saying anything, with only her smile growing even deeper. Wendy curled her lips. After their talk some nights ago, Nightingale's mood wasn't very good, but after the creation of the new card game it had somewhat improved again. But today, how was it that she was full of smiles? Where had the expressionless shadow killer from Silver City gone? Without getting an answer, Wendy took off her clothes and stepped into the bucket filled with hot water. Most probably, she had won a good card today. Chapter 108 Echo, Part 1. The months of the demons had already ended 2 weeks ago, and the snow has finally turned into streams which ran into the Shui River. The spotlessly white landscape slowly faded away, and the trees on both sides began to sprout again, becoming green once more. The land to the east of Border Town was the land Anna that had already cleared of trees and snow, and because of this it had now been turned by His Highness into the temporary practice ground for the First Army. At the practice ground, Carter was holding a gun and checking if the bayonet was securely installed. This was the newest invention of His Highness, but compared to the automatic operating machine and the modified snow powder, this new invention seemed to be a little too simple. The moment he had for the first time taken the new weapon into his hands, Carter knew almost immediately that it wasn't a qualified weapon. In short, it was just a sharp iron triangle, with the middle line as the base, which had two small iron pieces pointing downwards. Although it had a sharp edge, it was absolutely impossible to slash with the weapon. The blade was just too short. If it had to bend, it would immediately break. It had hardly any tip to speak of, while the other end was only around a thumb thick. Even if he was able to attack an enemy, if he tried to slash out horizontally, Carter couldn't say whether he would even be able to cut apart the enemy's clothes. This weapon had only one use, and that was stabbing. And before it could even be used, it still had to be connected to the gun. Used by itself, even a dagger would be a better weapon. In the eyes of the knight, it was totally unqualified to be used as a weapon and a big waste of pig iron to create such weapon with only one type of attack. If a blacksmith within his territory had dared to create such a weapon, he would have tied the man and given him one fierce beating. But even if it was such a bad weapon, Carter could still see His Highness' originality and his passion for all of the details. For example, the design for the connection between the gun and the bayonet. The mouth of the barrel had two grooves with a right angle at its end. As long as the two small iron pieces at the bayonet were fitted into the grooves and the bayonet was turned half around the barrel, then the bayonet would become fixed. Thanks to this concept, the grooves and the iron pieces didn't need to fit perfectly. If they were a little too loose, the gunner could just insert some pieces of paper between the two iron pieces and the grooves, and when it fitted better, only then should he rotate the bayonet. In the case that they didn't have any papers, tree leaves would also be okay. Put the bayonet on the gun. When they heard the keyword, the gunning team took out the bayonet from their bag and put it on the gun's barrel. Until now they had only been able to produce 40 of the new weapons and their supporting bags. So the soldier who didn't receive the new weapons had to put a short stick on their guns. This kind of action was almost trained through the whole morning, and now most soldier only needed to adjust the bayonet 2 to 3 times until it was fixed. According to His Highness' words, the bayonet should only be used as a last resort. He didn't want his men to start a close combat attack on their own with the bayonet. Carter disagreed with this statement. As long as a man didn't personally stab a weapon into an enemy, they would still be considered as children. Only if they saw their first blood would they transform from ordinary miners and hunters into soldiers. Iron Axe also stood among the ranks of trainees. Although he had previous claimed to only be a hunter, but from his skills Carter could see that the man had absolutely received special combat training before. His skills weren't any worse than the skills of any other knight. His Royal Highness had asked Carter to teach the soldiers how to use the new weapon correctly. Having received this order, Carter felt a little guilty. The bayonet was a kind of weapon he had never seen before, so it was impossible that he couldn't know how to use it. However, after seeing the prototype, Carter was once more immediately filled with confidence. After all, the bayonet was nothing other than the equivalent of a short spear. In addition, due to its special blade, it was much easier to use than the pike. Due to its unique blade design, the bayonet training method has also become very special. They didn't need to learn how to split, lift, block or sweep with the bayonet, they only had to train one move, stabbing. So the knight let all the soldiers line up and then began to teach them the most suitable method for stabbing, placing one foot before the other, bending the knees and then pushing their arms forward with their maximum amount of power. This kind of repetitive training method was extremely boring. So Carter was amazed that everyone was so meticulously completing this kind of training exercise. Before the winter they were all still a bunch of weak and lazy civilians, but now they behaved like a decent group of trainees. When Carter shouted a command they would immediately take action, and he had to acknowledge that they even put more effort into the training than the squires he had previously trained. Of course, if he were to give them a sword, or to say it using the words of His Royal Highness, if he gave them cold weapons, he would still be able to defeat them with a stick in a mere 3 strokes. But in terms of their willpower, their progress is already worthy of acknowledgement. After an hour of training, Carter let the gun team sit down and gave them a break. At this moment His Royal Highness the Prince also showed up on the practice ground, followed by a woman who was wearing a hood. This didn't take the knight by surprise. Previously, at the beginning of the training, His Royal Highness had informed him in advance that during today's practice they would be assisted by a witch. However, Carter hadn't known that the witch would be so tall. As far as he could determine it with his eyes, she was almost as high as His Highness. But nevertheless she is still exquisite and good-looking, Carter thought. Then he came back from his thought and let the soldiers stand up, allowing them to greet the fourth prince with a salute. "Your Highness!" The soldiers shouted and raised their hands. "Thank you for your effort." Receiving their greeting, Roland nodded, and walked around since he also wanted to speak with just Carter alone. But at this moment a soldier suddenly rushed in the direction of the prince. Discovering this, Carter frowned, placed his hand on the hilt of his sword and took a step forward, placing the prince behind himself. Nightingale had been even faster to react. Her hand appeared out of the fog and grabbed Roland's arm. As long as the situation turned out to go even slightly wrong, she would be able to pull the prince into the fog. But then they discovered that the person was rushing out was actually Iron Axe. And even more, he didn't run to the prince, but instead to the unknown witch, immediately falling down to his knees in front of her. Not the kingdom's normal kneeling on one knee, no, he threw his whole body flat on the ground, with his head deeply buried between his arms. "My clan leader." With this, the training of the gun team came to a forced break. Asterisk. First tell me, what's going on? Back in the castle hall, Carter, Echo, and Iron Axe stood in a row, while Roland sat at the lord position. He asked, clearly dissatisfied. "Discipline, you have to always maintain discipline. This is one of the most important rules within the militia, and now the army should also have the same iron discipline. Not to speak about seeing the clan leader, even if you were to see the king you shouldn't move even a toe out of line. This is the only requirement, there will be always time to report later." From the beginning on, Roland had a very good impression of Iron Axe, but with his action of today, he could only sigh. So his final analysis was, it seemed that his inner cultural quality wasn't able to keep up with his practical talents. He clearly hadn't understood the meaning of the word discipline. "Your Royal Highness," Iron Axe couldn't help himself to wait any longer. He wanted to kneel down, showing his regret. But when he was already halfway down on his knee, he was stopped by Roland. "Stand straight and speak." "Yes." Iron Axe swallowed nervously, and then began to speak. "I grew up in Iron's End City and vowed my loyalty and devotion to the Osha clan and the new clan leader Silver Moon." "No, Kabago, I am not the clan leader," Echo quickly disagreed. "No, you are," Iron Axe retorted. "Your father and brother already died, in accordance with the Osha custom. From the moment of their death you became the clan leader of our Osha clan. When I heard that you were sold to the port of Clearwater, I immediately went there, but I was unable to find you. I thought that you had died. But I dash." Roland interrupted Echo, one by one. "First let Iron Axe finish his story." "I will obey you until the end of my life, Your Highness." The story wasn't complicated. Roland was quickly able to understand the general idea behind what happened. Echo was originally a member of the Irons and Cities Osha clan. Her former name was Silver Moon, and her father had been the clan leader of the Osha clan. The people of Sand Nation didn't have an easy life. Irons End City was only able to accommodate a limited population, so every 3 years, each clan had to take part in the sacred duel, and the 6 clans who won would receive the right to live in the city, while the other clans either lived outside of the city, or went together to the Green Sea. These places were dangerous places to live, although they offered water, but the demonic beasts and sandstorms would cause a great threat to the Sand People. So during each sacred duel, the warriors of various clans would spare no effort in order to win. Chapter 109 Echo, Part 2. However, in the duel, the Osha clan lost to the insidious means that were used by the Tribbian clan. Not only that, but in the end, even their patriarch was killed and the clan ended up being exiled to the Endless Cape. Silver Moon, the daughter of the former patriarch now known as Echo, because of her outstanding appearance was sold as a slave by the slavers to a businessman from the port of Clearwater. Iron Axe with his identity as a mixed blood, despite being an adopted member of Sand People, was not a real member of the Osha clan. And therefore he hadn't been sentenced into exile. But because of his strong combat abilities, the other clans took a liking to him and wanted to recruit him to their side. Yet Iron Axe, who had over years received a type familial care from the old patriarch coupled with the hope of saving Echo, did not hesitate to reject the offers of the other clans. After a long and a difficult journey, he finally arrived at his goal, the port of Clearwater. But he never got to know that at this time, Echo had already been sold to the King of Grey Castle. However, in the end the latter was rescued by a witch, who'd belonged to the Witch Cooperation Association, while the other disheartenedly moved to the west border of the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Yet today, these two people unexpectedly meet once again in Border Town. "Then what are your plans for the future?" Roland asked after pondering for a moment about what he had heard just now. "Do you want to return to the south, take Echo with you and revive the Osha clan?" "No, Your Highness." Iron Axe went down on one knee. "I have already sworn to the three gods, that for the rest of my life I will always work for you. I was just too excited to see Silvermoon again. I couldn't control my emotions, please punish me." "What about you?" the prince asked Echo. "Do you want to avenge your people?" Being asked this question, Echo also knelt down before Roland. "When I awakened to my witch powers, I truly had the thoughts of seeking revenge. But today I no longer harbor such feelings." She bit on her lip and weakly asked, "Please allow me to stay here. I don't have anywhere else I can go." "I understand. Please, stand up," Roland said quietly. "You don't need to act in this manner. Don't worry, I won't banish you." He paused for a moment, then said strongly, "In fact, letting you achieve your revenge also isn't impossible." "What?" Iron Axe exclaimed in shock. He was unable to believe his own ears. Echo, however, didn't show much of reaction. After all, she had already let go of her hope of ever going back to Iron Sand City. "Of course, right now I'm unable to achieve it." Roland waved his hand dismissively. He didn't think of this idea on a whim. During Iron Axe's descriptions of the extreme south, he had heard some very interesting things, that this piece of land was hot and dry and that the environment had many strange things to offer. Especially the orange flames coming out of the ground that had burned for decades without going out. The orange fire was oftentimes burning above a huge pit. And at the bottom of the pit, someone could see the black sticks flowing endlessly. Orange fire, black sticks, were both words worth mentioning. When Roland listened to this description, one question immediately popped up in his mind: wasn't he talking about oil? Even more, open-flowing oil. How important this black liquid was to the industry's development no one really had to ask. After all, more than half of modern warfare was because of the need for oil. The rise and fall of the oil prices could even affect the rise and fall of a number of countries, and even change the patterns of the world. If he could somehow get control over the people in the south, he could maybe get a stable source of oil. However, for now, Roland did not have the time to think about disputes happening in a faraway area, which was out of his control. So without any better option, he had to postpone the show, since in ancient times, to a later day. "When I get hold of the throne, I will try to get justice for you." Roland went in front of the kneeling Iron Axe. "But today you violated the discipline of the First Army. From now on you are sentenced to 2 days of confinement. During these 2 days, you will reflect on your wrongdoings." "Yes, Your Highness," Iron Axe returned excitedly. "Then let us continue the training," said Roland to the knight, "and you will also be responsible for the next march." Asterisk. Brian thought that today's training had already come to its end, but everyone was still sitting on their place in the driving range. No one dared to disperse on their own. After all, before Carter left with the prince, he gave them the order to rest where they were, but not to dissolve. What should he do, if he had to wait until the time of his patrol? He didn't want to imagine such a scenario. "Sir Knight, you said that Captain Iron Axe won't come back," asked Nail, who was in the same group as Brian himself. "His unexpected action just now nearly gave me a heart attack." "How many times have I told you already, you shouldn't call me sir?" Brian corrected him again. in the First Army, you should call me group leader." After he was knighted by His Highness, his rank within the army had become a lot of higher. It even came to the point that other people didn't dare to talk to him, except for Nails. The little man worked as a miner before he joined the army. He was the only one who would often come to him to talk. According to Nails' stories, don't mention that he dared to talk with a knight. He even said that he'd had close conversations with His Highness. This kind of thing. His Royal Highness won't blame him too excessively, right? Although he gave him a reassuring answer, but the wariness in his heart didn't want to quell down. Once he had seen a civilian who accidentally collided with the occupants of a carriage and afterwards got stabbed to death by the guards on the spot. Such a tragedy. Even so, Iron Axe came from another country. It was still very daring to kneel in front of another woman when His Highness stood directly beside him. Even calling her patriarch, adding all this together was a big break of etiquette. "I guess that will be the case," nodded Nail. "I've spoken to His Royal Highness personally. He isn't like the other nobles." He scratched his head and seemed to try to find the right words. Even though they almost looked the same as him, they act totally different. Brian also didn't want Iron Axe to be punished too hard. After more than 1 month of collective training, he already felt a deep sense of admiration for this foreigner. Especially when he taught them how to build a tent for the case in which they happened to be stranded in the wild. They all benefited from the superb skills he patiently taught to them. In the eyes of the knight, Iron Axe was even more suited to be the commander of the First Army than Carter was. "They're back." Nail brushed against Brian's arm. "Hey, I can't detect Iron Axe within their group." No, it was time to stop his imagination from running wild. Carter had already ordered them to line up, according to how they had previously trained. When they were ready, His Highness stepped in front of them and began his speech. "The woman beside me is another witch. Her name is Echo. She and Iron Axe had been separated before for many years. According to the rules, Iron Axe was sentenced to days of confinement for disrupting the formation and violating the military discipline. No, I will repeat it once more, you all now belong to the regular army, and the most important rule for a member of this army is to always obey orders and maintain the discipline. Can you understand this?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness." Brian, like the others, shouted his consent. When he had heard that Iron Axe was sentenced to confinement, his heart was finally able to calm down, and when he looked in Nail's direction, the other one made a wry face. "During the following training, we will use her ability to simulate a variety of sounds, including musical instruments like horns and drums. She will play several kinds of marching songs, which will be your command to act. Everyone will move in accordance with the drums, always holding the same rhythm, keeping the team in one line." Here, His Royal Highness paused. "On the battlefield, Echo will always stand behind you. You can think of her as the banner of the First Army, and you have to always protect her with everything you have." Now that I've finished saying all this, everyone should become familiar with the next tunes. What is a marching song? Brian's head was full of confusion. Is it something like the music I occasionally hear when I visit a pub? This kind of soft music should be able to motivate you to move forward? But when he heard the melody coming out of Echo's mouth, he realized that he had never heard something like this before. He almost instantly understood the meaning behind His Royal Highness' words. The rhythm of the drum directly went into his bones, giving him the desire to move his feet, while at the same time the light melody was provoking his desire to fight. This so-called marching song, hearing this, it would boost everyone on the battlefield. It was a battle hymn to encourage everyone to keep on unceasingly moving forward. Chapter 110 Battle of Eagle City, Part 1. Through the misty morning fog, Timothy Wimbledon could vaguely see some flags fluttering in the wind at the top of the city's towers that were in front of him. He raised his gaze, trying to identify the emblem that was depicted on the banner. The sailboat with a crown pattern on top of a green foundation undoubtedly belonged to his sister, Garcia Wimbledon. It was the city's largest banner. The second banner had a white background and the image of a snake twisting around a pagoda. This emblem belonged to the Bayer family. When Timothy had first became aware of this flag, a feeling of contempt had risen up within his heart. But even after they coming and seeking refuge under the protection of the Queen of Clearwater, They still had enough pride that they'd hung their banner above the city. They were simply too brazen. "Wait until I catch you, I will make you eat your own flag, Earl Bayer," he thought. Finally, there was the Red Lion Tower, belonging to the equally shameless Sheet family. Outwardly, Timothy appeared expressionless, but inside his heart, he had already condemned Ellen Sheet to death. It was also the same for Tomon Bayer. Of course, both of them would get their very own banner to eat. "Sir Niemann, lift my banner, the banner of the Kingdom of Grey Castle," Timothy ordered. "As you command, Your Majesty," agreed Knight Linden, and then rushed in the direction of the troops behind them. "Long live the king, raise the flag." The newly crowned king turned around and saw his banner being raised. The grey flag was waving in the wind. The black pattern on it looked stately and awe-inspiring. It had a huge tower with 2 crossed spears on both sides depicted on it. This was the emblem of the King of Grey Castle. "Under this banner, I will condemn all traitors for their crimes against the throne." The moment Timothy received the news of Garcia's declaration of independence, he had immediately taken action to show her his answer. He had mobilized all of his troops together with the troops of the Eastern Duke, and given them the order to attack Eagle City. Although his self-confidence had clearly been shaken by Garcia's unexpectedly fast action. However, on the surface he seemed to remain calm. This greatly increased the faith that all his supporting minister had in him. He needed nearly a month before his summoned vassals and their troops could be gathered. Then it had taken a week to get to the east. From there they again needed half a month to reach their destination. It was only yesterday evening, when the sun was already on its way down, that Timothy had finally arrived in Eagle City. Fortunately, the months of the demons hadn't affected their march. The road to the south hadn't been blocked by the snow. His situation was almost the opposite of that in Border Town. The roads had become even stronger thanks to the cold temperature, thereby allowing his carriages carrying the food and his soldiers to move faster than usual. Timothy's team was very large. The forces were put together mostly from his own guards, the Knights of King City, and the special forces from the Duke of the Eastern Border, Duke Francis. Together they numbered 6,000 men, divided into 3 battalions, of which 1,000 men belonged to the well-trained and well-equipped rank of knights. According to the reliable intelligence he had been able to gather, he knew that the size of Garcia's troops was less than 3,000 people, and most of them belonged to the rank of Clearwater Port's free people. They were usually former farmers and businessmen who had just grabbed the nearest weapon they could reach. They would never really be a threat to his genuine knights. When his finance minister Sir Arthur Goldus had become aware of Timothy's battle plans, he had immediately raised objections. So shortly after the end of the months of the demons, the farming operation would become the highest priority. If the farmers were to be recruited into his troops, it would later affect the harvest. Acknowledging this objection, Timothy didn't require his vassals to deploy their serfs. Instead, they had to convene the freedmen in their territory and send them so that they could take over the responsibility for the delivery and logistic. As a result, even if they were to fight in the south, it wouldn't affect the harvest in the fall. From Timothy's perspective, no matter what he had to do, in the end, Garcia could not be allowed to stay in the south of his kingdom any longer. Eagle City wasn't a well-developed city. After all, previously it was only a marketplace situated in the middle of the surrounding towns. But later, just less than a century ago, with the increase of its importance to the surrounding towns, it slowly developed into a city. Because of the previous lord's plans to further promote the importance of its market, he decided to not build any insurmountable walls. How strong could an army of 3,000 civilians together with the men from 2 earls possibly be? So the sooner Timothy started his countermeasures, the better were his odds for him to win. If he was to give her even a little breathing space, she would quickly take over the whole of the southern territory, making it very difficult for him to push her back. After a night's rest and a good meal, his troops were now ready to fight. The sun gradually turned from a weak orange into a ball of shining gold, dispersing the morning fog. Soon Timothy could see Eagle City's earth-colored walls. In the eyes of the new king, they didn't deserve to be called walls. At best, they could be called an earthen slope. From the bottom to the top of the slope, it was just a ramp. Even without a siege ladder, his troops would still be able to directly climb it on foot. Furthermore, the slope only had a height of one person and just enough thickness to accommodate one person on top of it. While this so-called wall was good enough to block refugees and bandits, it would never be able to stop his heavily armed soldiers. It seemed the city walls were only very sparsely manned. Apparently they weren't ready to defend the wall. "Your Majesty, the cavalry which was in charge of observing the south gate have came back to report. They finally saw a group of men and horses moving," reported Knight Linden, who ran back to the king while leading his horse by hand. Timothy turned in the direction of Duke Francis and said with a knowing look, "It looks like she wants to run." Duke Francis took a careful look for himself and nodded, "That is most probably true, and can be considered a decisive action on her part. Eagle City isn't suitable for a siege. If she tried to defend this city with her troops, it will only become a clear victory for us." "It turned out the same as you had expected during the combat meeting last night. She really did not expect us to react so fast," he laughed. "We arrived at just the right time," Timothy said. "She was unable to move at night, even if she had wanted to." "You are correct, a march during nighttime is a big taboo. If she really had done it, and we then took the initiative to attack, her troops would easily collapse. And once the troops collapse during the night, they will seldom have the chance to gather again. Even if she was able to flee back to Clearwater Port, it would only be delaying the inevitable. So, my dear sister had to wait until the morning to order the troops to retreat." Timothy looked with satisfaction at the castle of Eagle City, which seemed to be waiting for him to take it. "It has to be hard on her, after all she has done, yet it didn't turn out as she expected." Garcia was too fond of the symbolic status of Eagle City, and the possibilities she felt when she stationed troops here. When holding the mansion of the guardian of the southern border, it would indeed be easier to conquer the hearts of the southern nobility. But the benefits were also accompanied by its own risk. Timothy had intentionally sent a slow-moving diversionary army along the way, while at the same time rushing with a division of cavalry to the east, without any infantry. The needed rations were transported by cart, which were following them. When they arrived at the Duke's mansion, they took the rest of the cavalry with them. From there they bypassed Eagle City and neared the city from the opposite side. The first mission of the cavalry was to block all roads, reducing the ability for the spies to pass on messages. But such big military activity was impossible to hide forever. Garcia should have gotten the news of their attack 2 to 3 days earlier than their actual approach, so that when they started their retreat this morning, it could be considered as a hasty move. Retreating from Eagle City to Clearwater would take 1 day on foot. So even if they ran on their 2 legs, Timothy could still easily overtake them with his 1,000-men-strong cavalry unit and easily kill them, which would naturally lead to the collapse of her ridiculous armies. Unfortunately, as long as she threw her 3,000 troops away, Garcia still had a chance to escape from Timothy's clutches by leaving the city on her own by horse. Like this, staying alive and returning to the port of Clearwater wouldn't be difficult. Even in the case that she was able to flee, I would still have ended this farce, he thought. "Your Majesty, according to the previously drawn-up plan we should separate now," said Duke Francis. "You will wait for me in the inner city after you bypassed the city and attacked from the south gate, right? And if we run into strong resistance or get cut off, we will take a detour." "I still think it's better if I attack from the southwest," Timothy answered. "For us knights, it isn't easy to move in the narrow streets, and Garcia may also obstruct our troops from moving forward by blocking the streets with lots of debris. Even if we have to take a detour and fight into the night, we won't let ourselves be prevented from chasing them down and slaughtering them." "Then I'm out, Your Majesty." "Be careful," Timothy reminded him. Even if Garcia didn't leave any troops in the city, she could still have left behind many traps. In addition, be aware of the narrow streets. There might still be many people left in the houses, only waiting for the right time to ambush you, so slay everyone you find. You can't leave any threat to your safety alive." "Ha ha ha," Duke Francis frankly laughed. "Your Majesty, please rest assured, I have followed you father into many battles. I have personally cut off hundreds of heads, and until now I have never been hurt." He waved with his hand and signaled the guard beside him to move. "Everyone, attack." The troops behind him got ready, split into several smaller formations that were under the leadership of other knights, and started to move in the direction of Eagle City. The troops in the front line were made up out of the freedmen, followed by the armored mercenaries, that were the main force in the siege, while the Duke's knights were fully focused on his commands. When the main force began to hit the walls, Timothy led the rest of the knights and their squires in the southwestern direction. Chapter 111 Battle of Eagle City, Part 2. The first batch of freedmen who served as the human meat shields didn't meet any resistance and were able to successfully climb the earthen slope. On top of the ramp formed from earth's slope, the defenders had built a wooden fence to block the attacking forces. The fence wasn't completely closed, instead, it had many openings for spears. During the time the attackers were busy destroying the logs of the fence, the defenders could simply stand behind it and use their spears to kill the enemy. However, contrary to Duke Francis' expectations, the defenders who should have been standing behind the fence were nowhere to be seen. The entire wall was currently in an unguarded state. So his vanguards carrying their axes were able to quickly open up some gaps in the wall. After the logs were out of the way, the rush towards the city began. A moment later, the wooden gate was also opened. "Let's go," said the Duke, and shook the reins of his horse and led the rest of his troops to the gates. From the beginning of the siege until when the gates were opened, less than 30 minutes have passed, so what the hell was Garcia Wimbledon doing? Frances frowned. Even if she didn't have much combat experience, she should still have known that she had to leave a small group of personal guards or hired mercenaries who had been bought with a lot of money and didn't fear death behind to block the enemy's offensive for as long as possible. Only in this way could she gain enough time for the larger group to flee. The third princess is clearly not a stupid person. Otherwise, it could not be explained why she was able to take over the south so quickly. So why hadn't she arranged for any men to defend the wall? Building a solid defense, even with well-placed traps in it, but with no one to operate it, is only a waste of money. Frances thought, "It's decided now, my personal guards will be the first group to step into the city and investigate whether the situation is safe." But later, when the captain of his personal guards came back to report, he reported that even within the city it was still the same situation, they hadn't met any resistance. However, there were indeed some wood and stone obstacles, but after his men had ordered the local inhabitants to work, those were soon removed. Hearing this report, Francis no longer hesitated and began to lead his remaining troops towards Eagle City. He had followed King Wimbledon III on many campaigns during the years and could be counted as a veteran, so how could he let himself be scared off by a little girl? Contrary to what one might expect, the time invested into analyzing the enemy's steps for mistakes was not wasted. Because if he could wait until all the gates were captured, he could directly ride through the city and save a lot of time. When he stepped through the gate, Duke Francis could smell something with a pungent smell. It wasn't the smell of rotting corpses which often appeared on battlefields, but rather more like a mixture of pine nut oil, tangerine peel, and incense. If someone took a deep breath, they could even imagine it to be a perfume. What is this smell? But when he observed his surroundings once more, he was unable to detect anything unusual. The only thing which didn't seem right was that the ditch for the drainage system was blocked, and the sewage was overflowing out of its channel, slowly flowing along the ground. It had accumulated so much filth that he couldn't tell how long it was that they hadn't been cleaned, but when the sun fell on these dark substances, it reflected in 5 splendorous colors. Probably the smell comes from this pile of sewage. Francis shook his head, clearing it of this unnecessary thought, then began to lead his unit further to the castle district. Since they took over Eagle City, they naturally had to go to the castle and the city hall, and look to see if there was worth looting. Of course, it was very likely that Garcia had already plundered the city, so there shouldn't be many gold royals left, but some of the larger crafts and ornaments were also very suitable trophies. Exactly for this occupation Francis had brought his own food carriages along. Regardless of the condition of the loot, everything would be loaded on the carriages. As for those mercenaries, most probably they were already looting the shops and the surrounding farms. Well, for now, this doesn't matter. It's more important that Duke Joey is already dead, and it's still unsure who will become his successor. So at this time it's a close battle, to decide under whose rule this city will fall. When Duke Francis entered the castle, he thought that he had come to the wrong place. From the outside it appears to be the castle, he thought. But they hadn't only taken all of the coins, no, they had cleared out the entire basement. They took all of the clothes and didn't even leave behind a single corn in the grain storage. The several frescoes hanging on the walls were also all taken, leaving only blank walls behind. There were no longer any books in the bookcases, and they also hadn't forgotten to take the bed from the Lord's bedroom either. In short, the whole castle had been stripped clean. Was this something that was done in a hasty retreat? Francis gradually became more uneasy. If this hadn't been planned out from the start, the castle wouldn't have been cleared so thoroughly. Right at the moment he wanted to go to the city hall to see if it was the same situation over there, a thick smoke suddenly began to emerge through the north gate. "What's the matter? Is something burning?" "I do not know, Your Excellency. I have already ordered Molière to go and take a look," the captain of his guard answered. "Perhaps it's a fire that has been deliberately set by the enemy." Yes, that must be the case. The Duke's first thought was that this all was a trap, but then he realized that this method of setting the gates on fire was meaningless. After all, they could easily bypass the gates, they only had to cross the slope and then they were already outside. Setting something on fire, without any additional attack was meaningless. After all, an organized team wouldn't need much time to put the fire out. The correct use of this tactic would be to set up soldiers at the inner side of the walls, who would wait until the fire had expanded all over the city, and then when the enemy's troops started to panic, that would be the time for their own surprise attack to start. If it's done like this, it can easily disrupt the enemy's formation, maybe even force them to retreat. But as he had said before, with no one to operate the trap, it was meaningless. At this moment, out of the direction of the three other gates, black smoke also began to emerge. And when he looked back at the fire at the north gate, he could see that it was spreading at much too fast a rate, as if the whole surroundings had been filled with straw. It didn't take long until the first cries from the civilians could be heard, indicating that some of their houses were already lit. This can't be right. Duke Francis thought, the fire is coming from the north gate, but there was nothing with which to feed the fire, there was only an open space. But if there was nothing, how can the fire spread so fast? Wait, suddenly a horrifying thought popped up within his mind. Could it be that Garcia Wimbledon had secretly recruited a witch? Francis reassuringly touched the godstone of retaliation which hung around his neck, calming quickly beating heart. Hopefully, it is only a fire ignited by a witch. As long as that is the case, I can directly walk through it. After all, with this stone, that demonic fire simply cannot hurt me. And furthermore, each member of my personal guards is also wearing this thing, so this fire can't threaten us at all. As for the freedmen, who have no money to donate to the church, I just don't have the time to attend to them. Regardless of the fact that he possessed such a stone, the city had still become dangerous, so he decided to flee to the war camp at the south gate. From there he could not only monitor Eagle City, but also wait for the new king to return with the cavalry. When he thought his next steps through, he immediately gave the captain of his guards the command, "We will leave the city through the south gate. During the ride you will blow the horn to gather all of our troops." "As you command." Everyone immediately went on their way, but when their group came near the south gate, the flames had begun to cover the whole city, already setting many civilian houses on fire. The heat emitting from the fire became so hot that they were forced to retreat. In addition, the commoners who were originally hiding inside their houses behind closed doors, were now on the streets and fleeing from the flames, crowding the whole streets with people. They became so many that even the sword-swinging knights were unable to move forward. There was nothing which would help against this panic-stricken people fleeing to the only open space available, which wasn't burning yet. At this moment it seemed as if everything would be consumed by the surrounding flames and smoke. "Everyone calm down, we have to get to the well. From it we can draw water to fight this fire." Duke Francis quickly gave some orders. "Don't try to save the houses, they are out of control. Just extinguish the burning obstacles on the streets, so that we get a path out of the city. Don't stop the horn signal, let other people know where we are." "Sir," shouted a knight who came from the direction of the city center. The knight didn't even wait until his horse had stopped, instead, he immediately jumped off the horse. When he took a closer look, he discovered that it was the knight sent to the north gate by his captain. "Sir, at the north gate we are unable to get the fire under control." "What did you say?" Francis couldn't believe it, so he had to ask again, "You are unable to fight the fire?" "The flames are burning on this black water," she said quickly. "Not only is it not extinguished with water, it is even quickly spreading over it, and now the whole northern city is burning." "An immortal fire," Francis murmured. "Yes, it has to be demonic fire." And then the Duke shouted, "Do not panic. This is Garcia taking advantage of the ability of this evil witches. As long as you wear God's stone of retaliation, you're safe. Even if these flames seem frightening, they simply cannot hurt you. So that's the reason you were so benevolent." Molière subconsciously stroked her chest. "Sir, what should we do? With the God's stone of retaliation we don't need to fear anything. Everyone launch, we will break through." The Duke waved his hand. "These demonic fire, as long as we wear the God's stone of retaliation, it will disappear without a trace." He paused. "Molière, you will lead the first group of people out, I will stay here and wait for the people who are still coming." The female knight nodded in confirmation. "Sir, you have to take care of yourself, pay attention that you don't." Then she turned around and rushed without any hesitation towards the raging fire at the end of the street. Chapter 112 Battle of Eagle City, Part 3. It seemed as if the king's knights were holding a sharp silver blade when they cut into the rear of Garcia's retreating troops. The crowd broke into chaos and a lot of people fell to the ground while they were trying to flee, only to end up getting trampled to death by the horses. Occasionally some of them pulled out weapons and tried to resist the attackers, but against the superior knights they were soon cut into pieces. Leading this kind of unstoppable flood was an elite knight from the camp in the Cold Wind Ridge. It was Knight Naaman who served as the spear point for this attack. Furthermore, his blue cloak which danced in the wind behind him was particularly eye-catching. Wherever he went, the enemy would try to flee. Every time after his sword cut down, it would be covered in blood. Timothy Wimbledon instead stood in the distance on a small hill, overlooking the whole battlefield. At this point, the 3,000 people of Garcia's troops were no longer able to hold together their formation, instead with every second they were falling further and further apart, which brought them to almost completely halting their march. "They won't last much longer," Timothy thought. "The moment when the second of my 3 teams attacks they will collapse. These people simply cannot resist the assault of Greycastle's elite knights. Most of them aren't even wearing any armor. The moment a sharp blade comes close to them, they immediately start losing their will to fight." Everything happened almost exactly as he had expected. After spending 1 hour to bypass Eagle City, they had turned over and rode through a sparse forest, finally reaching the road. Back on the road, Timothy ordered his knights to start rushing, and finally, 1 hour later they were able to catch up with Garcia. According to the advice of Duke Francis, Timothy divided his troop into 3 teams of around 300 knights, and let them take turns in attacking the different sides of the enemy. Like this, he was able to hold some troops back and was always ready to send in reinforcements when it was needed. In order to avoid the possibility that they might get surrounded, his knights were not allowed to attack the center of the enemy's formation and instead they should attack its flanks. With short speedy dashes, they only cut off the leftovers, with each charge killing only dozens of people. This tactic was obviously very successful. After a few runs the enemy already had more than 100 casualties, while still being unable to even retaliate. They even tried to organize a counterattack with their own cavalry, but the gap between their equipment and training was just too far off. Compared to the Knights of the King, the momentary patchwork of cavalry was nothing more than a group of horseback riding infantry. The moment when they came face to face, those cavalry made of the men that had been brave enough to charge into battle were simply killed, or if they were lucky they were able to scatter in all directions. This unilateral massacre was a great blow to the enemy's morale, and soon Timothy noticed some of Garcia's troops begun to break away from the formation and flee in all directions. "The time has finally come for us to launch our main offensive," he thought. When the Cold Wind Knight came back from leading his attack, Timothy didn't order him to start the next round of shock tactics. Instead, he signaled him to come over to his side. "Your Majesty, their formation will soon come falling apart. Naaman wiped the sweat from his forehead away, whilst leaving some bloody marks on his face as he did. Naturally it was the blood of his enemies. Until now he hadn't received any injuries during the whole battle. Seeing this, Timothy took his own handkerchief and handed it to him. "Well done, you can take a break now, it's finally time to deliver the death blow." Seeing that the next round of shook attack wasn't coming in, Garcia's troops also realized that the decisive moment was coming. Her large group completely stopped their forward march. Instead, they unhurriedly gathered, until they had formed a tight formation. Every outermost soldier was holding a wooden pike, and held it up, waiting for the impact. Discovering this, Timothy only scoffed. In his eyes, it was nothing more than an already dying man's last struggle. Without barricades, without armor, only with flesh and blood alone you want to resist the mighty impact of my knights. This can only end in disaster for you. No matter which cards you have left, my dear younger sister, you won't be able to change the outcome. Naturally, it could also be true that you have already departed long ago, leaving this group to die and buying time for yourself to flee. But he soon discovered he had been wrong. Within the crowd, they once again put up the banner of the Queen of Clearwater. Seeing this green banner with the sailing boat and the crown fluttering in the wind, made Timothy frown. So he lifted his binocular and took a closer look at the enemy. He soon discovered standing behind the warriors who had raised the flag was the blurred figure of a woman who seemed to be shouting some orders. Even so, he couldn't clearly see the other one's face, yet her grey hair flowing in the wind gave her identity away. Garcia Wimbledon had not run. Timothy took a deep breath. Well, this only means that this farce will come to an end here. I don't have to follow her to Clearwater Port. After waiting for the horses to be fully rested, the new king gave the signal to start the main attack. The cavalry formed from the knights and squires was around 800 strong, and under the leadership of the king's own knights, started the attack against the enemy. It was once more the Cold Wind Knight who was at the tip of the attack, Naaman Moore. Just at the moment when the attack would finally hit, suddenly on both sides of the horizon, a huge numbers of troops appeared. After sending out strange war cries, they immediately began to rush into the direction of the battle. Timothy couldn't believe what his eyes were showing him. Without raising any flags or wearing any emblems, the suddenly emerged troops didn't resemble any known force of the kingdom. After a closer observation, Timothy saw that they were all wearing different armors and weapons. But with their high stature and weird faces, Timothy knew they could only be from one place. The Sand People from the extreme south. He didn't need to guess any longer if they were friend or foe. Without a doubt, Garcia was able to make a deal with them, leading this group of damned foreigners into the kingdom of Grey Castle. Only the thought of what this meant made Timothy burn with rage. He immediately shouted, "Give the signal, break off the attack." But it was already too late. Such a high-speed assault was impossible to be broken up with such a short notice. His knights were directly impaling into the heart of Garcia's troops, cutting through them like a hot knife through butter, with only one goal, reaching the Queen of Clearwater. Timothy eagerly looked into the direction of the flying banner, hoping that it would break. The troops of the Sand People coming from both sides were each around 1,000 men strong, making Garcia's forces 5,000 people strong. This was a size that Timothy was unable to face. Furthermore, the Sand People had a strong build and were always warring against each other, which had turned them into a great threat even to his knights. Only by killing the enemy's leader, cutting off their flagpole and breaking Garcia's forces, would he have still a chance of winning. However, even so, the flagpole swayed a bit, but it was still standing straight. Finally, the Sand People were able to close the circle, blocking the knights' last way out, and started joining the battle. Without these reinforcements, Garcia's 3,000 desperados would have been defeated long ago. But at the moment, they were still persisting, and just like a swamp, swallowing one knight after another. Hearing the horns blowing to retreat, the knights who were closer to the edge were trying to free themselves came rushing back to the king. But many of them had ridden too deep into the enemy's forces and were now trapped, including the Cold Wind Knight. Currently, he was fighting against a 9-feet-tall warrior of the Sand People while breathing heavily. The other side was waving around a wooden stick as long as two men, causing a small area to open up around their fight. Unfortunately, Naaman's mount had already been crushed to death, and it was only thanks to his extraordinary reaction and agility that he was able to stay alive. But without a mount, his heavy armor led to a rapid consumption of his physical strength. And when he once more stepped sideways trying to dodge, his foot slipped and he was hit by the stick in the middle of his chest. The strength of the attack that came hitting against his armor was so huge that it broke into 2 pieces. His blue cloak swayed once more through the wind before he finally disappeared in the crowd. Half an hour later, the knights who were still left fighting had become less and less, and when the Sand People turned in the direction of Timothy's Hill, he grit his teeth and gave the order to withdraw. His entire group of people began their retreat northward. Compared with the huge force he had previously led into battle, the new king now merely had 300 people still left around him. Chapter 113 Warning. Since the end of the month of the demons, it has only rained for 2 days in the west. All the other days had been sunny days. Apparently, this was compensation for all the snow during the winter. The musty air in the office had also been swept away, becoming fresh and clean as nature, and when he opened the windows the sweet-smelling fragrance of spring would sometimes float into the room. At this time, the road between Border Town and Longsong Stronghold had nearly been restored to its former quality. But with each passing day, Roland would become particularly more concerned about the matter with the stronghold. Every year after the return of land traffic there would also be merchants coming to Border Town selling their fresh goods, but until today he had yet to see any merchant coming in from Longsong Stronghold. Lightning was by now flying 2 times a day to Longsong Stronghold, to ensure that they would have an early enough warning to be well prepared for the enemy's arrival. Over the past week, the First Army has entered the comprehensive exercise stage, which included setting up the defensive line in order to welcome an enemy's attack and also trained in how to pursue and attack an enemy. For the former they heavily relied on lighting to always inform them of the distance between them and the enemy. The artillery and gun teams would shoot according to her orders, making it much easier, regardless of whether it concerned giving orders or acting on given orders. For example, shooting solid shelling at 800 meters and 500 meters, while using canister shelling when the enemy approached 300 meters, and firing with firearms at 50 meters and so on. As long as they saw lightning raising the corresponding flag, the team leader would then give the signal to his team to attack. The key for the victory on the battlefield laid in the pursuit and attacking stage. According to Roland's plan, when the enemy was defeated, they would turn around and retreat to Longsong Stronghold, for which they would also need to use 3 days. Even if the Duke fled on his own, leaving his militia and the hired mercenaries behind, he would still need 2 days for the journey, so he had to stay for at least 1 night out in the wild. This gave the First Army the perfect chance to chase them. The whole process of monitoring would be done by lightning, while the First Army would always be out of the enemy's scouting distant but ready to catch up at any moment. The artillery and ammunition would be transported by the town's civilians. When the enemy had established their night camp, it was time for the First Army to completely encircle them, and at dawn of the next day they would start the attack, completely annihilating the opposition. Even though the plan didn't seem complicated, it was almost impossible to coordinate the 2 troops because of the absence of any modern communication devices. Roland could only hope for the witches to make up for the lack in communication. How the final result would end up, even he himself was unsure. Another critical point was that his gunpowder reserves were running low. Because of this the First Army was unable to use live ammunition during their comprehensive exercises. However, the main goal of the training had been to increase the gunner teams and artillery teams' collaboration, as well as the coordination between the First Army and the witches. Roland has sent people to go further down the Shui River to Fallen Dragon Ridge and Redwater City, hoping to find new sources of saltpeter. If I'm unable to replenish my reserves of gunpowder, I am afraid after 2 more fights, the guns in the hands of the First Army could only be used as spears, Roland thought. Roland wrote a number of items he had to procure on paper which included saltpeter, grain, seeds, and other supplies. He intended to send one of Barev's apprentices to the king's city to try his luck. That place had sufficient merchandise, it especially had enough saltpeter. With the summer approaching, the king would surely have started to gather saltpeter by now. As a city filled with wealthy aristocrats and also wealthy merchants, when the weather started to get hot, the consumption of saltpeter would become staggering. He hoped to find a stable supplier who could provide Border Town with a stable stream of the raw materials needed to produce gunpowder. Prior to this, he had already sent out 2 of his personal guards, one to implement the plan called Gathering the Witches and another to work on the Finding the Fruit program. The former had posed as either a traveler or a businessman, and spread out through the streets and lanes, pubs, and other places the rumors of Border Town being a safe haven for witches. Of course, it hadn't been said that the host was the 4th prince himself. Instead, he news that spread had been that they had been able to find the Holy Mountain, and that the Witch Cooperation Association was now looking to recruit new members. The other had gone directly to Clearwater Port, and purchased some peculiar crops from the fjords from across the ocean. Of course, when he found any particular seeds in any of the cities on the journey, he had also sent them back. Having finished with his purchasing list, he handed it over to Scroll, allowing her go to the town hall and hand it over to Barif. After Scroll left, Roland stretched out his hand to drink some water, but only to discover that his cup was empty. Just as he was about to get up and take the kettle off from the fire, Nightingale was already bringing over the pot to the table. More than that, she even smiled while she filled up the cup, and when she put the kettle back. Roland slowly sipped his tea, while trying to think of what would have happened to make her smile like this. Recently the attitude of Nightingale was somewhat off. In the last few days she had always had a smile on her face, and even more, she was now even taking the initiative to serve him tea. Does she secretly want a raise in her wages? Previously, she would only sit on the sofa while holding a pot of dried fish and gnawing on some for the whole afternoon long. Although Roland had already asked her what had happened, she only laughed and refused to answer. He simply had to let the question go. Could playing Gwent really make people so happy? Later, when he invents poker and mahjong, he could just open a casino, and the money would come in on its own. Stop. Roland shook his head, pushing the thought to the back of his head. Now wasn't the time for pleasure-seeking. He still had to consider what he would do after achieving his victory against Longsong Stronghold. Should he perhaps relocate his office to Longsong Stronghold? Roland had considered this point for a long time. Moving to a more prosperous land would seem to be quite tempting, but it wouldn't in fact be a very good choice. Longsong Stronghold had more than 100-year longer history than Border Town did, so there were many different forces that were struggling for power, while the other nobility also took a lot of power. The territory was supervised along the principle to divide and conquer. Even as the Lord of Longsong Stronghold, it was difficult to handle matters in the territories of his subordinates. In the case that Roland would want to grasp all of this power for himself, it would be very hard to achieve without causing a revolution. Even more, it was a territory where the fish and dragons were mixed in together, so his own safety also couldn't be guaranteed. He did not want to walk in the streets while always having to fear that a radical aristocrat would attempt an assassination. Compared to this, Border Town was completely different. Here only he had the final say. The surrounding land was vast, so he wasn't in an urgent need to expand his territory. Most of the people were either miners or hunters, or all from the same social rank, and with his success during the month of the demons, his reputation among the people has greatly risen. Most importantly, after the integration of the First Army and their propaganda, most of the people have accepted the existence of witches. When compared with Longsong Stronghold or other cities where the church had a lot of influence, Border Town was much easier to turn into the witches' safe haven. Therefore, Roland decided to use Border Town as his core area. As for the fortress, he decided to let others manage it on his behalf and that he would only be there to provide support from afar. After all, as long as they provided him with a steady flow of workforce as well as paying taxes, he would be satisfied. What he was missing the most of at the moment was people and money. So Roland's consideration for Longsong Stronghold was that they would provide him with the coins and the people for the continued construction of Border Town. Like this, the gold royals from the defeated nobles would return back to the hands of the commoners, who would then use it in the markets of Longsong Stronghold, from where he would get the money back in form of taxes. In addition, maybe he could through a number of preferential policies to convince some people with special skills to stay for the long term in Border Town. But all these were still only some rough plans. Things such as who would administer Longsong Stronghold in his stead, or the specifics of the taxation system, would have to wait until the end of the battle to be considered. At this moment, a figure in yellow suddenly flew through the window only to stop beside the prince's table. This figure was Lightning. "You've worked hard, have a drink first." Roland took his cup and gave it to her. She took the cup from him, but she didn't drink. Instead she only shouted, "Your Highness, they are coming." Chapter 114 Thunder. The vast amount of Longsong Stronghold's allied forces were on march to Border Town. The front of the force was comprised out of the 6 knight families in the stronghold. From the various armors that the knights were wearing, it was easy to determine how strong each family was when compared to the others. Without a doubt the most eye-catching amongst them were Duke Ryan's knights. Their horses were a branch of the king's breed of short-tailed horses, which were exceptionally good at long-distance running and had a larger body than that of other horses. Yet even with how amazing the horses seemed, the knights sitting on their backs seemed even more powerful. Their armor was created by the famous Longsong Stronghold hammer and dragon-tooth blacksmith, which gave them a unified look. On their thick breastplates was carved a huge and shiny silver lion's head, while on their shoulders were pictured 2 wolves, which seemed to be opening their mouth to let out a roar. Their cloaks, which were waving behind them in the wind, was embroidered with delicately decorative designs, and around their waist, every one of them had also tied a red band. These knights were not only eye-catching. Each year after the end of the months of demons, it was exactly these knights who were responsible for cleaning up the remnants of demonic beasts and ensuring that it was once more safe to travel through the land. Every one of them had accumulated a wealth of combat experience when fighting one-on-one. They weren't much worse than the knights of the king were, they were just less in numbers. Of course, as a duke, being able to support 150 elite knights was already an amazing feat. So when Duke Ryan looked at his knights, he always had a very satisfied expression, never doubting for a moment that there was no one in the West who had enough strength to stop him. Walking in the middle of the retinue were the mercenaries. Their equipment when compared with the knights was much worse. The majority of their attire was some out-fashioned mail or plate armor lacking either the gloves or helmets. There were even some people who were only equipped in cheap leather armor, and they were also wearing all kinds of different weapons. While walking along the road they didn't hold to any formation, but were rather always walking in small groups of 2s or 3s, oftentimes even laughing as they went. Seeing this, one could have the feeling that they weren't on their way to battle but instead seemed to be going out on a hike during the spring. At the end of the line, walking behind the mercenaries were the freedmen who had been pressured into service by the Lord, dragging a single-wheel cart behind them which was loaded with food and tents. Due to the difference in the movement speed of the 1,500 people, which resulted in a very slow-moving retinue, the knights riding at the front would have to stop from time to time and wait for the troops behind them to keep up. "Sir, Count Elk," Holger Medela pulled the reins of his horse so that he could directly ride side by side with the Duke. "We are half a day away from the border town. If we continue at this pace we should arrive there by 4 p.m. At that time, it would be the best if we let our troops rest for the night, then tomorrow morning we will start the attack. Or do you perhaps want to attack the prince's castle immediately? It seems you want to sleep in the wild, too." The Duke laughed. "I myself would prefer to sleep in the castle's bed rather than the wet mud. Of course, we still have to give the royal family a little respect. So, when we arrive at Border Town, I will send messengers to persuade the prince to surrender." Count Honeysuckle, riding slightly in front of them, turned around and said, "The cavalry has already spent a whole day out in the field, the people and the horses are tired, so starting a direct attack wouldn't be very appropriate, right? After all, even though he only has miners and hunters, it is still a fact that Roland Wimbledon was able to spend all of the months of the demons inside Border Town. I think it would be for the best if we remain a bit cautious." "Haha, I can understand that others don't know it, but that even you don't know the truth about the demonic beasts. My old friends. They are really scary when met in the wild. They move fast and nimble and have astonishingly strength. In other words, they are deadly opponents. But if you're standing behind a wall, then they are just stupid beasts." The Count of the Elk family shrugged. "I was more surprised with that he could build a wall so quickly. But with that alone he cannot resist the might of our knights, correct? They aren't mindless idiots." "That is exactly the case, and I have also received a message from the north. Duke Ryan casually said, this year in Hermes they'd had to deal with an unusually large force of demonic beasts, almost resulting in the fall of the new holy city. So thinking about this logically, it seems that this year's demonic beasts were mostly directed in their direction, and here at the west border we'd only had to deal with the few that have slipped through the net. As the lord of the whole western territory of the kingdom, his eyes were not only concentrated in this remote place. Through these years he had placed many eyes in all of the major cities who continually passed him all the newest information. But at the moment, the tragic war in the north wasn't the place where his main focus laid. A few days ago he had received a secret letter from Steep Cliff City, which informed him that the new King Timothy Wimbledon and the Queen of Clearwater have held a fierce fight within the southern territory of Eagle City. According to the news, Timothy's team should need a month to return from Eagle City. The letter hadn't mentioned the result of the fight, and it had only stood that after Timothy had come back to Steep Cliff City, he had lost thousands of troops, which had made it impossible for him to keep up the blockade against his sister. It also seemed that Eagle City had become a victim of the fire. The black clouds of smoke had almost covered the whole sky. This spectacle had all been witnessed by the residents of the surrounding towns. Without a doubt, regardless of whether the Queen of Clearwater had died to the hands of Timothy or not, such a painful loss of soldiers was a serious blow to the new king. The content of the letter had made Duke Ryan so restless that he had on that very night sent out many trusted aides to King City and also into the Eastern Territory, hoping to learn more about Timothy's circumstances. Perhaps this large battle between the two monarchs would give him the opportunity to destroy the still unstable regime of the new king. He absolutely did not mind throwing a torch on an already prepared bonfire. If he wanted to become an independent king, now was the best chance he would ever get. The soldiers of the north were buried under the feet of the new holy city. The south has just experienced a war and was still lying on the ground while licking their wounds. The east border lords and the new king weren't in a better situation either. But he was afraid that in a few years they would come back into power. As long as he got some people to attack the north, it could easily tear the kingdom of Grey Castle in half. By then the territory and population under his rule would be comparable to that of the kingdom of Eternal Winter in the north. With the two biggest cities in the southeast under his control, his strength would be comparable with everyone else's in the kingdom of Grey Castle. And he, Osmond Ryan, would become the first king in this new country. After he thought everything through, the Duke smiled in satisfaction. He wanted to end this farce with the prince today, and tomorrow he would immediately go back home. Fortunately, 3 days later I will be able to welcome my trusted aides back to the castle. Hopefully, they will have some good news for me. As the sun gradually went downwards, approaching the top of the mountains, Duke Ryan could finally make out the outline of Border Town, and outside of the town, he saw a number of densely packed silhouettes. Father, Duke, René, who was in charge of the leading the front, came back to report the people in front of us should be the guards of the fourth prince. They are all armed, clearly showing that they don't intend to welcome us. Well, at least we don't have to bother with going to the castle to ask him to surrender. The count laughed. Inform the knights they should slow down and should stop at a distance close enough for a charge. Yes, father. After receiving his orders, René turned around and left. Duke Ryan raised his view and looked at his opponents. The guards in front of him all looked very strange. They were also holding strange weapons. They stood side by side in two lines. If you were to call their weapons pikes, that would mean that the pikes did not have the correct ends, and the grip was also too short. Moreover, his counterparts adopting the disposition of trained troops was also against any common sense. Their line of defense was so thin. Weren't they running with open eyes into their own death? This made the Duke a little confused. Even if the prince has no common sense or any battle experience to speak of, he still has some knights and also his personal guards by his side. Aren't they able to prevent him from making such a mess? Thinking about for a moment, the Duke decided that he would let the mercenaries lead the charge, while the cavalry would stand aside and remain ready to start their charge at any moment. Of course, he would still send out a messenger to try persuading the prince. Go over and tell the prince that I don't have the intention of hurting him, Duke Ryan said, but I still have an obligation. The new king's order. They won't be harmed if they put their weapons down without resistance. On his way back to the king's city, I will treat him according to the treatment of nobles. Getting his army into formation was a very slow process. First was the cavalry, they went one after the other onto their positions, while the mercenaries were slowly taking their position at the fore. But at this moment, Duke Ryan suddenly saw 4 short flashes of fire in the enemy's camp. First came a flash of light, then there appeared some smoke. He frowned, thinking that there might be something wrong. He even thought about taking out his binocular, but then suddenly a series of thunder-like noises exploded near to his ear. Chapter 115 War for Border Town, Part 1. When the enemy finally entered his field of vision, Danner immediately noticed the heavily armed knights who were riding on huge horses, wearing bright and dazzling armor and slowly riding towards Border Town. It was usually the case that the rank of a knight was much higher than that of the common townspeople, and when he was suddenly confronted with about 100 of these, he had to take some deep breaths to calm himself. Danner felt how his palms became sweaty. It was just like the time on the wall when he had to face the demonic beasts for the first time, but this time he faced creatures that were the same species as himself, the joint forces of Longsong Stronghold's nobility. No, that's wrong. He angrily spat out and threw his former thought aside. You think they're the same as yourself? When have the nobles ever treated you as if you were of the same species as themselves? He asked himself mockingly. The only goal of their trip is to snatch Border Town away from us and bring the Northern Slope mine back under their control. More importantly, they even intend to drive His Royal Highness out of the Western Territory. As a member of the First Army, I cannot simply allow this. During yesterday's pre-war lecture, His Royal Highness had made it clear that Timothy Wimbledon, the brother of His Royal Highness, had conspired against the throne and in the end even killed his own father King Wimbledon III for it. Originally these happenings between the royalty and aristocracy hadn't mattered that much to him. Is there any difference for me if the king was to change? But now that Duke Ryan wanted to grasp this opportunity to take His Highness's territory away, this he now found totally unacceptable. When he thought about it, just how had his life been before His Highness had come to Border Town? If he was remembering correctly, the former lord was actually a count who had rarely shown himself. The acquisition of the furs was done by his personal guards who often used their weapons to lower the prices. And when the months of the demons arrived they would all flee to live in the slums of Longsong Stronghold and end up suffering during that whole time. But today, under His Highness' control the life in Border Town had become better and better, with changes being visible for everyone to see. Danner thought, for example, when the miners had achieved a higher output they would also receive a higher payment. And even after His Highness put this black machine into the North Slope mine, the additional output had still counted for the miners' work. Whether it was when building the walls or mining gravel, everyone was paid on time. During this whole winter, there wasn't even one person who had frozen or starved to death. Of course, the biggest change was the implementation of the militia. No, now it's called the First Army. Having them guarding the town, we commoners don't need to huddle together in these wooden sheds begging for others to give us food. If the prince isn't here any longer, would the duke still allow for the First Army to keep on existing? Danner took another deep breath and wiped his palms against his clothes. No, he certainly would not allow it. The nobles of the stronghold don't care for the lives of us commoners. It is exactly as His Highness had said before, only an army composed of the commoners will be willing to fight for the lives of other commoners. Danner raised his head so that he could keep the left part of the sky inside his field of view. There in the distance he could see a small black dot circling around. When one was only taking a casual look, anyone would think it was actually just a large bird. But in truth, it was the artillery intelligence commander, Lightning, who was using the trees growing on both sides of the road as cover while constantly observing the enemy's movements. When she flew back, Danner also noticed that as long as she did not take the initiative to fly over open areas, the people on the ground would only be able to see tree branches if they were to look upwards, so it was nearly impossible for them to detect that there was a witch that was flying over their heads. After a quarter of an hour, Lightning flew closer to their frontal position while flashing a green ribbon. This was signaling to them that the enemy had entered a range of 1,000 meters and that they should prepare to start shooting. Danner didn't know how far the distance His Highness called 1,000 meters was, but when he saw the green signal, he just subconsciously followed the rules of the comprehensive exercise. giving the command to load the cannon and adjust the angle. It didn't take the 4 groups of gunners a long time to complete their tasks. The cannon angle was adjusted to the 3rd setting while the gunpowder and the solid artillery shell were also inserted into the cannon's barrel. He had thought that after he had stood on the wall and fought against the demonic beasts he could regard himself as an experienced fighter and also thought that he was talented, but today he came to discover that there was still a huge distance between himself, Iron Axe and Brian. During the afternoon assembly, he'd had great problems trying to calm his heart. But these 2 men, when they led their groups to the appointed area, they not only looked as if there was nothing special about today, no, he could even hear from Brian's voice just how eager he was to fight. But he himself until now was unable to calm himself. With a bit of shame in his heart, he had to acknowledge that even the Rodney brothers seemed to be acting better than his own performance. This thought made Vanner feel very depressed. He nervously licked his lips and checked Lightning's position once again. But at this moment, the enemy's movement slowed down by a lot. "What are they doing?" Rodney asked. "That's currently unknown," Cad's Pa answered. "For me, it seems like they are adjusting their formation. But they still look a little chaotic." "They are waiting for the other troops," explained Jop with a slightly trembling voice. "It's impossible for knights to fight alone, they always need a large number of people to follow them." "How do you know all this?" Nelson wasn't convinced. "I have already seen it. A knight will always take along at least 2 squires, while there will be another dozen serfs who have to handle their foraging." He began to count it off on his fingers. "First, there is the Duke, as the Lord of Longsong's stronghold, he has at least 100 knights, right? Then there is the light cavalry, who are at least 300 people. Plus, the counts and viscounts who have their own territory. Many more. And don't forget the mercenaries, they have all already tasted blood themselves, so they won't even blink as they kill you. They will do anything for money. While we only have 300 people. Actually, less than 300 people, Vanner corrected in his mind. We only have 270 soldiers armed with weapons. According to His Highness's explanation, it is because we lack in the area of production capacity. Now those who did not have guns of their own were sent to the artillery teams. They were to handle preparing the ammunition for the 4 cannons. When Vanner discovered that they were a lot slower than his own group, he also felt a lot better. "The mercenary, they're coming!" Jop cried out. Vanner looked towards the enemy. There he could see a group with various kinds of armors taking the front in their battle formation. They did not ride, nor did they march in line, they just walked in small groups of 2s or 3s to the middle of the field. While the knights scattered to both sides, it seemed as they were giving up their position for the mercenaries. After a quarter of an hour, the Duke's allied forces were finally ready. At this time, a knight came riding out of the enemy's camp into the direction of Border Town. Vanner became so nervous he almost gave the command to fire. "What should I do?" Vanner looked once more at the sky, but he was still unable to discover Lightning, while the enemy was constantly coming closer while waving a white flag. "He is the messenger sent by the Duke," Jop muttered. "He should be coming over, trying to persuade the prince." "It's none of our business." Rodney squatted down behind the cannon and aligned his line of sight with the center line of the barrel. "Leader, we need to adjust the cannon. Most of the knights have left the impact zone." During their previous practice with live ammunition, they were repeatedly taught that the cannon attack range was represented by the center line of the barrel, so if they wanted to hit their target, they had to make sure that the target overlapped with the barrel's centerline. So the 5 men began at the same time to turn around the cannon until the cannon once more pointed in the direction of the knights. The messenger who had come in alone was then escorted by Carter to the back of their defense line, but Vanner knew that this move of the Duke was just a waste of time. The prince would never agree to surrender. Suddenly, Lightning abruptly flew in the direction of the defensive line, wildly waving a yellow flag in her hands. The yellow signal meant that the opponent had entered the 800 m range. At this distance, they had the chance to hit the target with a solid projectile. It also meant that as long as the gunner captain didn't prohibition firing, the gunner teams could fire at will. His other team members also noticed the signal, so they all looked into his direction, and after he nodded once he took a deep breath then shouted, "Fire!" Chapter 116 War for Border Town, Part 2. It was not the case that the knights could charge from the beginning at their fastest speed. After all, horses were limited by their physical endurance, so they were only able to maintain their fastest speed for a short period of time. At 1,000 or 800 meters they would begin to gradually increase their speed until they reached 500 meters away from their mark. Only when they came within 200 meters would start galloping. While in theory, the 12-pound Napoleonic cannon had an effective range of up to 1,300 meters if it used solid shells. Maybe because it only had half the diameter than normal, Roland's cannon only had an effective range of 1,000 meters. As a result, the furthest distance his artillery group were allowed to open fire at was at 800 meters. At this distance, reaching the target area could be guaranteed, while at the same time the cannon balls would also bounce forward after hitting the ground, resulting in line damage, with a high chance to kill multiple targets with a single shot. In order to let the mercenary attack first, Duke Ryan had ordered his knight to step to the side, letting them wait in an absolutely safe area, meaning an area where bows and crossbows were unable to reach the knights, but this distance was still close enough for an effective night charge to be launched. Knowing of the low efficiency of the mercenaries, the knights were always ready to pull the horses' reins, waiting for any resistance in one place. However, like this, they became an almost fixed target for the artillery group. But the Duke certainly did not realize that by the time he ordered his troops to step aside, that they had already stepped onto Roland's prepared battlefield. While the middle of the road might have been flat and spacious, both of its sides were crammed with leaves and with other vegetation. What seemed from afar to be just ordinary grass, was in truth actually thick vines covered by a knee-deep layer of weeds. It was like a road plastered with natural tripwire. If the cavalry wanted to start a flanking assault on the defensive line, they would only be able to move forwards with a very slow degree of progress. The 1,000-meter distance was clearly marked on the ground. It may not have been visible for the people on the ground, but to lighting flying in the sky, it was clearly visible. The battlefield was precisely divided into several segments, and every differently colored mark represented a different distance. The enemy was now just a ruler moving about on a chessboard, which permitted the artillery group to shoot without having to calculate the barrel's angle. They only had to go through the steps as they had implemented them during their training. The cannon of Vanner's group was the first to roar with fury. A large amount of gas generated by the detonation of the gunpowder pushed the projectile outwards, and at the moment it flew out of the muzzle, it had already reached a speed of more than 400 meters per second, so after 2 seconds, the shell had already almost reached the knights, directly flowing through the group of knights and boring itself into the ground beside the road, splashing soil and gravel into every direction and creating panic amongst the horses. One knight reacted a little too late and fell from his horse. The following next 2 shells also missed their target and only created a lot of dust. But the last group was able to get a lucky hit. Originally there was no one in its flight path, but a knight who was unable to gain back the control over his frightened horse happened to pass right into it. In front of this huge amount of kinetic energy, his armor existed in name only. The cannonball simultaneously pierced through the thin iron and human flesh, and after it bounced off the ground, it then hit another knight, cutting off his calf. Furthermore, it ended up penetrating through the horse's chest under the knight's hip and spreading its internal organs all over the ground. If the knight were in their normal phase of attack, the artillery group would need to adjust the angle of their shot, but the sudden blow had apparently shocked the whole coalition of the Duke's forces. They didn't know what had hit them. How could they? The shell was too fast to be seen with the human eye. So the knights didn't receive the command to attack. Instead, they were still pacing back and forth in their original location, trying to appease their skittish mounts. It was once more Vanner's group who was the fastest to complete the reloading process, starting the second round of shelling. The new weapon exposed just how fragile and soft the human body really was. Once hit by a passing iron ball, could cause injuries which were unable to ever be healed. But when the rider was directly hit by it, in addition to him losing several limbs, it would also splash blood everywhere. Only when they were hit by the second round of artillery shells, were they finally able to make out a vaguely black shape, while it was taking the lives of their companions. After the second round of shooting, the Duke was finally able to connect the fire and roaring sound in the enemy's camp with the indescribable strike against his unit. It seemed the other side had gotten its hands on an incredible weapon, with a range much farther than a crossbow, almost like one of the stronghold's trebuchets. Realizing this, the Duke immediately gave the order to sound the horns, thinking that as long as they were able to come into close range, these long-distance weapons would also become useless. The knights, however, when hearing the horns, showed several kinds of reactions. Some of them really rushed into the direction of border town, but others were still fighting with their own horses, while a small part of the knights was retreating toward the rear of the battlefield. Together with the mercenaries swarming around, the whole scene quickly turned into chaos. When the attacking knights returned to the road, the artillery group suddenly became frantic. In addition, to clean up the barrel and reloading its ammunition, they also had to adjust their cannon. At this time, Lighting flew once more in the direction of the defense line, holding a red ribbon in her hands. The red signal meant that the enemy was approaching the 500 meters line. At this distance, the artillery hit rate would reach more than 80%. Banner shouted, "The shooting angle is correct. Quick, light the fuse, light the fuse." When the deafening roar could be heard once more, he didn't even look to see if they had hit anything. Instead, he immediately turned toward the ammunition distribution staff and shouted, "Canister, send in the canister shelling." During the artillery training, His Royal Highness has repeatedly stressed the point that when the red signal was hissed, even if the barrel was already loaded with solid shells, they should immediately shot and then reload with canister shells. In case that the barrel wasn't loaded, they should immediately fill it with canister shells, and then wait until the point where the enemy reached the 300 mark. The canister shells looked like a tin filled with thumb-sized balls and sawdust. To produce the canister shells, they first bore a hole into the tin, then they filled it with balls and sawdust, and then they stopped it with a thin piece of wood. When Lighting finally showed the purple ribbon, the 4 artillery groups fired almost simultaneously. This was also Banner's first time using the canister shells. According to His Royal Highness, the wounds induced by canister shells were very difficult to heal, so they only practiced the loading procedure. So today it was also his first time seeing the amazing killing potential of these special shells. Because of the huge pressure difference, the tin fractured into many pieces after it left the muzzle. The small iron balls inside of the tin fell like raindrops on the enemy, placing the knights 300 meters away into the middle of a deadly metal storm, and turning the people and the horses into a bloody mist resembling the falling wheat as it was cut down. Some iron pellets after penetrating the knights' bodies still had so much kinetic energy left that even the knights standing behind them weren't able to escape either. The knights lucky enough to survive the storm finally entered into sprinting distance, while only having one thought in their mind, that was to break through this thin line of defense, and massacre those cowards who were only able to hide behind those cruel weapons. Only a short amount of time was needed to cover the last 150 meters. The knights were already lowering their bodies, pushing the horses to reach their highest speed. However, this seemingly short distance of 150 meters turned into an uncrossable distance. The last round of firing of canister shells completely destroyed the last bit of their fighting will. In the range of 100 meters, the solid iron balls were able to penetrate through as many as 2 to 3 people, turning the area in front of the cannon fire into a field of death. From the 20 knights riding at the forefront, almost none had been able to survive. The only difference between them lied in the amount of iron balls by which they had been hit. The knights' assault had completely collapsed. Because the fear created by the collapse of the knights' assault was so huge, the knights following attempted to turn around their horses wanting to flee the battlefield. When they saw the knights scatter, the mercenaries weren't willing to take another step forward. They had always only been working for the money, but they immediately turned around when they saw how much they would have to pay. Now, at the moment of their retreat, they ran even much faster than they had during their attack. When the wave of their crushing defeat swept over the dukedom's allied forces, the situation soon became impossible to control. The crowd had only one thought left: they had to flee. There were people who fell and were trampled to death. No one took the time to care for others. They only hated themselves for not being able to grow another pair of legs. At this moment the melody of the guerrilla warfare song resounded through the battlefield. and the lines of the infantry began to march in step, sweeping across the battlefield. Chapter 117 Chase, Part 1. It was Carter's first time that he seeing a battle. A lineup of more than 300 knights was unable to even scratch the edge of their defensive line. Instead, they had been totally crushed. Until the end, they had failed to even enter into a range of 50 meters. It was the hunter team's fire line. Only when the enemy had come closer than 50 meters were they allowed to open fire. The 4 cannons had brought the enemy's assault to a complete halt at merely 100 meters. Along the range of 150 to 100 meters, laid an orderly row of 20 bodies. It was as if they had run into a wall. And these men, like himself, belonged to the strongest category of fighters, knights. Otherwise, they would have never been able to control their horses under the sound of gunfire. In the end, Carter was glad that he wasn't one of them. He felt a faint hunch that the battles in the future would become very different, and it was only a matter of time until Roland Wimbledon, the master of such a powerful force, would aspire to the throne and aim for kingship. When the members of the First Army saw the bloody battlefield, they became dizzy and began vomiting or had other adverse reactions. But this wasn't the reaction they would show if they had personally killed the enemy during close combat. The sense of deterrence brought on by killing someone over a long distance was much less when compared with killing someone with a knife. Their reaction couldn't be counted as critical. Carter picked a set of people from his own team to pick up the severed limbs and put them back with the dead bodies, while still searching for the living people. The sun gradually fell behind the mountains, and when Carter looked at the blood-red sky, and the distant woods with its crying crows, he was suddenly hit by a dull and dreary feeling. The era of the knights was over. Even until now Duke Ryan was still unable to recover. He couldn't understand how it was possible that he had lost, even more to a line of defense as thin as a slice of onion skin. Normally it would have been enough to poke it with just a finger to run through it, but today, it was his knights who fled like they had come face to face with the devil. In truth, he couldn't even blame them because the assault was under the command of his elite knights. His personal guards had even to chop down several people so that the blindly fleeing mercenary didn't come close to the Duke's position. But he was unable to do anything else. No matter how much he shouted, he couldn't unite the defeated men once more. In desperation, even Duke Ryan had to retreat with the flow of fleeing people, and their mindless escape only stopped after they had crossed nearly 10 miles. When the night came, the Duke chose a place close to the river bank to camp. Even after setting up torches to lead the separated knights and mercenaries back to their camp, most of their people were still missing. To make matters worse, the freedmen had without any hesitation left in the carts with the food, so tonight they had to slaughter a few horses to serve as rations. The 5 nobles huddled together, within the camp's largest tent, looking with a fearful expression towards Duke Ryan. However, even he wasn't in any better constitution. Who can tell me what kind of new weapon it was that they had used? They are far better than crossbows, and they don't seem to be throwing the stones like with a catapult. The Duke began to speak, while glancing at Renee. You also stood at the forefront. Tell me, what did you see? My lord, I couldn't see anything clearly, Renee answered. I only know that every time this roar was heard, our men would fall in batches, especially when it sounded for the last time. It seemed like the rushing knights had been hit by an invisible wall. Furthermore, I also saw how their heads and arms were split from their bodies. It was just as if, he thought for a moment, we were like an egg dropped from the height of a city wall. Was it the power of a witch? Count Earl whispered, frightened. No, answered the Duke, my knights were wearing a god's stone of retaliation, so the power of a witch couldn't have hurt them. We weren't attacked by witches. In front of those stones, they are nothing more than an ordinary woman. Oh, that's right, sir, Renee suddenly spoke up, as though he was remembering something. Before I heard the loud bang, I saw how carts which stood in a row, they had a huge iron pipe. It emitted a red light and a cloud of smoke. An iron pipe? What red light and what smoke? Doesn't that sound like the ceremony barrel? Count Elk asked with much doubt in his voice. The Duke, of course, knew what a ceremony barrel was. Previously they were only used by the king at the beginning of major celebrations, but today nearly every lord would use them. Even he had 2 ceremony barrels made out of bronze in his castle. They were used to light up snow powder. But that sound, when compared with today's breathtaking thunderous noise, couldn't be further apart. The ceremony barrels would never be able to kill knights, Count Honeysuckle said. No matter what the prince used, it was powerful enough to defeat us all. So what should we do next? Hearing this, Duke Ryan glared in his direction. The sound of the word defeat was especially ear-piercing. We haven't lost, he insisted. A battle alone doesn't decide a war. We only have to reach the stronghold. There I can put another force together, while at the same time I will also cut off trade from the Shui River. Without any food supplement, Border Town wouldn't be able to survive for another month, and as soon as he dared to bring those villagers out, my knight will rush at them from all sides and in the end, defeat him. Eventually, the victory would become his, just as had he wanted, but the loss he had already suffered couldn't be made up with just such a small town. His dream of taking over the north turned out to be only a bubble. Damn. If I will ever catch that Roland Wimbledon, I will have to make sure to cut him into 1,000,000 pieces. But my lord, the fleets crossing over the Shui River aren't only coming from us, there are also ships from Willow Town, Fallen Dragon Ridge and Redwater City. If we cut everything off, wouldn't, Count Honeysuckle clearly wasn't convinced. I will buy everything, it doesn't matter to whom they sell. As long as they receive their money they will be satisfied, said the Duke with a frosty voice. Now everyone should head back to their own tents and go to sleep. Tomorrow morning we have to rise early and ride further down the road with the knights. Everyone who doesn't have a horse will stay behind to lead the mercenaries. No one is able to march during the night, even if the fourth prince intends to pursue us. He can only start at dawn. The first enemy he will encounter will be the mercenaries, he thought. Even if that group of trash collapsed on the first encounter, I still have many people left who will fight for me. During the whole of next day, the Duke didn't receive any news of the fourth prince having caught up. In order to confirm the news, he sent his trusted aides to expand the search range, but they all returned with the same news. This finally let him feel a little relieved. Most probably this new weapon has the same problem as our trebuchets. They are too heavy to be transported and can only be used in defense. Relying on only his bunch of miners with their sticks, he doesn't dare to act so reckless. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Duke had ordered his knights to stop for the day, waiting for the people behind him to catch up. Close to dusk, the mercenaries and freedmen were finally able to catch up with his remaining 66 knights. And they then all became busy setting up a circle of hastily erected tents. He only had to survive for the night. Tomorrow he could rush and reach Longsong Stronghold, then he would finally be safely behind his 30-feet-high limestone walls, his hundreds of guards and the naturally formed moat. Even if the other side could use their new long-range weapon, he could just use the trebuchets placed behind the wall to counterattack. Against all this, the prince couldn't win. But all day long the Duke had a constant feeling of discomfort. He constantly had the feeling that someone was staring at him from afar. Most probably it is just an illusion, he thought. I might just be a little too nervous. The next morning, the Duke was awoken by the sound of gunfire. When he rushed out of his tent, he could see people everywhere who had covered their heads and were trying to sneak away like rats. Yet, from time to time he could still see a fountain of blood or sail splash into the sky. When he looked to the west, he could see the enemy lined up in their strange uniform, quietly standing outside his camp. At the moment there was only one thought in the Duke's head: how had they caught up to us? How come they weren't detected by the knights that I've sent out yesterday? My lord, you have to flee, shouted a personal guard who was leading another horse at his side. This awoke Osman Ryan from his blank state of mind. He immediately jumped on the back of the horse and followed his guard to the east. However, not long after they had left the camp, they saw another lineup of this strange force. Wearing the same kind of leather uniform, holding the same strange short stick in their hands and also standing in 2 neat rows, even their facial expression was nearly the same. Then the Duke once more heard that cheerful tune with its extremely rich rhythm. At the same time the prince troops began to march at a neat pace, directly towards his direction. Chapter 118 Chase, Part 2. Even though Roland had let the First Army train for 2 times a day, he had never let them march during the night. It was dangerous for an army to march during the night. They wouldn't be able to see the road, there was also the change that they could get attacked by wild animals or snakes. It was easy to get lost, and if they used a torch they would become a natural target. So he had to wait until dawn the next day before he could let his army march, trailing the Duke's forces. In order to ensure the smooth succession of operations, the prince decided to follow the first army on the battlefield. Of course, compared with riding on a bumpy road and getting a sore bottom, he chose to rather take a ride on Little Town. After half a month of training, Hummingbird was now able to lighten and transport a 12-pound cannon for a fixed distance. Roland also took into account that the heavier the object, the longer was the enchanting, longer the process would take, so he arranged for her to begin with the transformation at dawn. He also had to take into consideration that the first cannon had to be enchanted for the longest, and the remaining cannons would be enchanted in a descending duration in order to ensure that the 4 cannons would lose their enchanting as close together as possible. Thanks to Hummingbird's ability, Little Town was now capable of carrying 4 cannons in one go, as well as the corresponding members of their artillery teams. The huge cement boat was now full of people. In addition to the artillery team and Roland, there were also Anna, Nightingale, Nana, Leaves, Echo, Hummingbird and Lord Pine on the boat. Lastly, there was also Wendy. She was responsible for providing the power, and Brian acted as steering man. It could be said that with the exception of Scroll, Soraya, Lily, and Mystery Moon, who were all witches who couldn't fight, almost the whole nest had come out. Originally it hadn't been necessary for Anna to join them on the battlefield, but under the firm will shown in her eyes, Roland couldn't find it in his heart to let her stay behind in Border Town. 6 troops of the First Army's gunner team were under the leadership of Carter and Iron Axe, following the marks created by lightning, who alone was responsible for keeping track of the enemy. This group of people was quietly marching behind the enemy, always keeping exactly outside of the scope of the enemy's scouts. At the moment Lightning became aware of the enemy's scouting activities, the army would immediately stop its forward motion. Along their road they were also able to capture a lot of scattered mercenaries and freedmen, but at the moment they weren't able to deal with the surrender of the enemy. So they had no other choice than to disarm them, so now there were other guards who didn't belong to the gunner team following together with them on the road. This was Roland's first time to guiding his army on mission of conquest. He was standing on Little Town's bow and feeling the morning breeze, while at the same moment also feeling enormously proud of his own success. "What are you laughing at?" Anna suddenly appeared by his side, and was directly looking into his eyes. She asked. Roland quickly put his smile away. "Nothing." "Really?" She took out a handkerchief and gave it to him. "You have saliva on your face." Roland had the sudden impulse to jump into the water. "Thank you." When Lighting reported about the enemy's camp, the sun was already set. According to the information she gathered during her investigations, the enemy apparently showed the signs of walking away from a heavy defeat, which resulted in the drop of their morale to the freezing point. When they set up their camp at dusk and sent their knights to scout, they couldn't wait to end their investigation and return to the camp, out of fear of not finding their way back in the dark. Roland's troops were stationed on the shore, 2 kilometers away from the Duke's army. All along the road, they didn't meet with any enemies, so the plan to wipe out the enemy was already halfway successful. Now he only had to wait until the first light of the next day, and then while the enemy was still in the preparation phase their siege could begin. This was Roland's first time he was spending the night in the wild, and he was more inclined to sleep on Little Town than to meet all the reptiles which would run through the camp. The cannons parked on the ship and the inventory in the shed had already been emptied out and brought into the camp so that Little Town could become the temporary residence of the prince. In addition to Roland, the other witches also stayed on board for overnight. The floor was covered by mattresses, and everyone was lying down shoulder to shoulder. Roland wanted to show modesty, but in the end, the witches were much less concerned about this matter than he was. With the exception of Anna, they had all faced a lot of hardship during their life, fleeing from place to place, so sleeping in the wild had become common for them. Soon, everyone was able to fall asleep, only Roland and Anna had difficulty sleeping. The former was so used to a soft bed that he had some difficulties adapting to the deck's hard surface, while the latter didn't know what she should think. She ended up just turning to the side and watching Roland. However, when the prince turned his head, Anna would always quickly close her eyes, pretending to be asleep, but in the moonlight, Roland could still see her eyelashes slightly jitter. If he wasn't afraid that the others would wake up from the noise, Roland would really want to pinch the tip of Anna's small nose, forcing her to open her eyes and then afterward hold her in his arms. In this manner, they both ended up being unable to sleep for very long. When the sky was still not light up, Roland began his plan to encircle the enemy's camp. He divided his army of 270 into two teams, each group of them would be supported by 2 cannons. One of them was sent to the rear of the Duke's camp, around 1 kilometer down the Duke's path. Lightning was still responsible for monitoring the Duke's movements, but in addition to this, when the cannons were set in position, the little girl also had the instruction to inform Roland. The moment he received the signal, he would send Carter out together with the rest of the First Army to start storming the Duke's camp. To prevent the cement ship from drifting away from the correct route, Nightingale would step into her fog. After all, her black and white vision could also be used as night vision, so with her instructions, Brian was able to maneuver the ship as if it was still the middle of the day. This process had been repeatedly practiced, and now everyone was able to do their part even with closed eyes. Wendy was once more in charge of powering the sails. Under her effort it was almost as if Little Town had become highly ambitious. In merely 1 hour all the troops had been placed into their positions and Iron Axe had taken over command of the interception team. Seeing this, lightning flew above Carter's team, and showed them an orange flag. At this point, the first lights of a new day could be seen. And now the plan of encirclement and annihilation had finally stepped into its final part. Since Carter's team was only responsible for protecting the 2 cannons, they didn't need to move forward, so Echo was assigned to work under Iron Axe's command. When Carter's team reached the camp, they quickly moved the cannons into position and directed them towards the enemy's camp. At this moment most of the enemies were still sleeping. With the typical roaring sound of the cannons, solid shells crashed into the enemy's camp. This woke the knights and mercenaries who came rushing out from their tents, but they were already awaited by Carter's team, who were all quietly standing there in formation. With their former day's experience of defeat, no one even dared to challenge the seemingly thin line of defense. They only flocked together and tried to flee towards the east, directly into the arms of the already waiting Iron Axe. When the enemy appeared his field of vision, the final stage for the moment of the Duke's annihilation had been set in motion. Echo began to play her music, and under the sound of her drums, the 2 neatly arranged lines started their move forward to the enemy. In order to put some pressure on the Duke, Iron Axe had to take the initiative to attack and intercept the Duke. If they just stuck to their former place, the enemy would likely spur their horses and bypass them, then escape into the woods. Duke Ryan had fallen into despair. He was unable to understand how the others were able to catch up and even overtake them. Should I just confess my failure and surrender? He wondered what Roland Wimbledon would do to a duke who dared to draw his sword and attack a member of the royal family. Would he imprison him? Would he send him into exile? But more than likely he would just send him directly to the guillotine. No matter what, the future of Longsong Stronghold would certainly have nothing to do with him. Seeing how the enemy had came closer step by step, as well as how from time to time the roaring sound and red fire of this fearful weapon would once more spread terror within his men, he knew if he didn't flee at this moment, he would never again have the possibility to escape. He only had 30 people left, so this really was his last chance. They cannot stop us, the Duke shouted. As long as we cross the road, they won't be able to catch up with us. After all, they only have 2 legs, furthermore we are only half a day away from the stronghold. The Duke then began to push his mount forward. Unfortunately, not everyone had such a desperate spirit as himself. In the end, except for his personal guards, only some other people followed his assault. The music stopped. The other side stopped at exactly the same time, as well as standing in a neat line like a wall. He then saw how the other side began to raise their strange sticks. When there was only around 100 steps remained between the Duke and the human wall, he could hear one banging sound following after another. He then felt a piercing pain in his chest and abdomen, giving him the feeling like he was hit by a warhammer. Then came paralysis and the feeling of helplessness. His body began to fall backward, finally falling down from his horse. While falling, the Duke opened his mouth trying to say something, but no clear sound came out. he was only able to cough twice, then a strong sweetly smell entered his nose, and his throat was blocked by a sticky liquid. Then darkness began to surround him. Chapter 119 Ransom, Part 1. Petrov Hull sat in front of his desk subconsciously. He was playing with a piece of parchment he held in his hands. It was the weekly delivery of the theater's afternoon program. If this were peaceful times, he would have chosen a good drama and let his housekeeper pay the deposit, afterwards sending an invitation to Aurelia. But he was unable to read even one word that was on the parchment. Today was the 7th day of the expedition. If everything had gone smoothly, his father should have already come back yesterday alongside the retinue of the Duke. Perhaps they were delayed during their journey, perhaps the horses had gotten tired and they'd had to rest, or they might have taken an extra rest day in border town, right? He tried to comfort himself, but the feeling of uneasiness in his heart was slowly growing. The fourth Prince Roland Wimbledon had left a deep impression on him. Petrov couldn't understand why such an outstanding prince would have received such a terrible assessment by the king. Bad character, dandyism, incompetence, ignorance, and without having any learning or skills, any of these evaluations didn't fit the prince that he knew. Because of this, his anxiety only became stronger. He feared that the Duke would lose against the prince. Master Petrov, his housekeeper shouted, there is a letter that has just arrived from the stronghold. A letter from the stronghold? Bring it to me, Petrov ordered. Even before he had opened the cover, he was already stunned by the identity of the sender. This letter had been written by the fourth prince. Duke Osman Ryan used military forces to attack a territory under the king's rule, trying in vain to start a rebellion. Furthermore, the Duke was already executed on the battlefield, and now the Longsong stronghold is once more under the rule of the kingdom. Had the Duke lost? His heart sank when he began to read further. With exception of the die-hard members of the Duke's Guard, the most of the others had pleaded guilty. Normally treason against the royal family would be punished by death, but because of His Highness' kindness, only the leader was put to death for his evil crimes. However, the others still cannot be pardoned. So the rest of the rebels will be handled in accordance with the war customs and will be held until their freedom can be bought. The Longsong stronghold's castle will be used as exchange point. The following people on this list's freedom can be bought. The document was extremely awkward phrased. It was not written with the diplomatic turn of phrase, but it was still able to express its meaning clearly. The Duke's rebellion had failed, and if they wanted to free the prisoner they would have to offer money in exchange. When Petrovs read the names on the following list, he saw that his father's name was impressively written in the first line. He shouted the housekeeper's name, prepare the carriage, I'm going to Stronghold's castle. The territory of Count Honeysuckle lay to the east of the stronghold, so when Paul arrived at the castle area, it was already half an hour later. The Lord's castle was full of the members of the militia who he had never seen before. They weren't wearing any shiny armor, neither were they wearing any cloaks or bands, instead they held a strange baton in their hands, with a kind of spear on the top. They just stood there in two neat and tidy rows, with their heads high and their chests out, simply expressing their power in their imposing manner. After he identified himself, Petrov was allowed access to the gardens and he was then led by a guard towards the castle's grand hall. This was a place he had already visited many times before, but when he entered it today, it was like he was entering a completely new territory. All the guards standing in the corridors were ones he had never seen before. No one smiled at him after he greeted them, they just stared back blankly. He was stopped by a knight before the entry door of the hall. State your name. Petrov Hull, Petrov answered slightly unhappily. He didn't like the other one's interrogatory tone, and so he emphasized, for you, it's Lord Hull. I see. It seemed like his counterpart didn't accept that statement as being the truth. Instead he just looked at the parchment in his hand. Shalafi Hull, Count Honeysuckle is your father. I'm Carter Lannis, the chief knight of the fourth prince. Please come with me to the side room first. We need to check if you have any weapons hidden on your body. After a thorough search, only Petrov's godstone of retaliation was taken away by the guards. That's not a weapon, Petrov reminded. Of course not, the knight nodded. We will return it to you after the meeting. He opened his mouth, but in the end, he didn't say another word. They really will give me the stone back? His god's stone of retaliation was one of the strongest kinds, with a worth of at least 50 gold royals, so he couldn't believe that the other side wouldn't replace it with a defective stone. That isn't important, he thought, I will just take it as part of the ransom. When he finally entered the hall, he saw the fourth prince sitting on the throne writing something down. When the prince raised his head, he had a startled expression on his face, but then he laughed. We met once again, Mr. Ambassador. It was still the familiar face and tone, letting Petrov feel a little more relaxed, so he gave him a bowing salute. I present my regards to you, Your Royal Highness. Sit down, said Roland, raising his hand to offer him his seat. In all likelihood, you want to know what happened. I can tell you that your father was not hurt, he was the first to surrender. Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness, Petrov said quickly. I do not know how much ransom Your Highness will want. As long as my father can be let out, I will immediately send all of our money to you. I do not need money, Roland shook his finger. I want livestock and people. It was normal to want livestock, and even 50 years ago, when the conflict between the lords had ended, most of the time the loser had to pay for cattle and sheep. Stories like this was something he had oftentimes read in books. But people, what would that mean? Your Royal Highness, cattle, sheep, horses, of those the honeysuckle territory has a lot of. As for people, very simple, I'm in need of bricklayers, masons, carpenters, farmers, serfs, and so on. The prince handed him a scroll. You can pay us according to the numerical conversion above. As long as you can reach the total number of 3,000 it will be enough. He smiled. Conveniently, it was this count from whom he had caught the most knights, so he also had to pay the highest ransom. Petrov spread the scroll at the table. Written on it were the names of all kinds of domesticated animals and the profession of people, followed by a number, such as cattle 3, sheep 2, mason 10, and the like. He immediately understood the meaning of all this. A value of 3,000 was the same as a herd of 1,000 cattle, or 300 masons were only enough to redeem his father. Of course, his territory wasn't able to provide so many cattle and masons. But with this paper, he had so many possible combinations of items, so many choices. As a noble who had to work daily with trade, Petrov instantly realized how much finesse had been put into this list. Just a few days would be enough to calculate the optimal solution for the minimum costs for his territory, which would still meet the requirements of 3,000 points. Your Royal Highness, I can. One day, you only have one day. Roland stretched out his index finger. This only means that you have to make your choice in one day. After all, you can't gather so many people and animals in 3 to 4 days. But I can't always stay here. At most I will stay here for a week, then I will leave. One day it is. Petrov suddenly got so shocked that he stared at Roland with large eyes. Wait, you just said that you want to leave? What does this mean? If the prince didn't lie in the letter, then the duke has already died on the battlefield. With this Longsong stronghold now belonged to his highness. But now he was actually saying that he wanted to leave. Why would he want to return to that small and broken down border town? No, that was beside the point. The key point was that if His Royal Highness went away, who would manage this magnificent city? His mind became a stormy sea. Would one of the Duke's children inherit the throne? When he thought through everything that he knew, this didn't seem to be a possibility. After all, it would only be a question of time until they build up a new force to avenge their father. In addition to the Ryan family and the other 5 noble families, were there any others who could take over? Yes, Roland nodded. I'll take the ransom and then I will return to Border Town. Petrov's mind was suddenly filled with an outrageous idea, and the moment he had thought of it, he was unable to suppress it. Your Royal Highness, Petrov began, then he had to swallow and was only able to whisper. Excuse me, is there also a numerical value which can redeem Longsong Stronghold? Chapter 120 Ransom, Part 2. Hearing this question, Roland looked at Petrov in interest, and then laughingly said, You're the first person to ask me that. He then took his cup and drank from it, afterwards stated explaining in a casual tone, There is no doubt that Longsong Stronghold belongs to me. It's still mine, even while I'm not here. But, I do need a man, or a family, to supervise the stronghold for me, so you should not be asking for a ransom, but rather for a representative's fee. Representative. Petrov was no stranger to this word. As a sharp-eyed businessman they would always fix their aim on increasing the output of their territory, but all the peddling nobles didn't really have the time or would express disdain for this sort of work, so in the end they could look for others to sell their goods to. In order to obtain that right, the merchants had to pay a sum in advance, as a deposit. How many gold royals would you want? After asking, he took a deep breath to trying to calm himself down. This would be a long-time deal, so it wouldn't be over with just one payment. Roland paused. Every month you have to pay 30% of the stronghold's tax revenue, as well as a material worth of 1,000 points, everything else would be for yourself. That doesn't sound excessive, Petrov thought, as long as I could get complete control over Longsong stronghold, so it seems that even the prince can be fair. But first I have to confirm that the prince isn't actually joking, that he really is willing to go through with this. This would really be a golden opportunity. Petrov was completely hooked. I and the prince aren't mortal enemies. Since the duke has completely failed, his children will also be deprived of their right of inheritance. Even the coalition of 6 noble families can't defeat the prince, who can prevent him from taking over the western territories. To join the stronger side is one of the basic principles of the continuation of one's own nobility. If I can gain the approval of His Highness before the other 4 families even know of it, House Honeysuckle will become the strongest family within the Western Territories. Your Royal Highness, why don't you want to stay in Longsong Stronghold? The castle has so much more to offer than Border Town does. What you really want to ask is, why I don't want to manage Longsong Stronghold myself, right? Roland looked slightly embarrassed. There are many reasons. For example, the power structure would get so entangling that I would have to spend too much time and effort trying to straighten out the relationships between each of them. Furthermore, don't forget the profit. As a local nobleman, I think you or the others would know better than I do how to really govern this territory, so this would become a win-win deal. Besides, there are plenty of other reasons. You may start thinking about it when you go back. The prince played with the silver cup in his hands. Oh, that's right. In the case that I would select you as a representative, I also won't have to fear that you will come to build a force trying revenge the duke, right? Of course not, Your Royal Highness. Although the last question came a little unexpected, Petrov was still able to answer it immediately. Since the duke is gone, the first thought in the other 5 nobles' minds will be how they can come to take over his territory. Regarding matters such as revenge, who cares? But Petrov also knew the reasons the prince had given him weren't his actual reasons. The power structure would be too complex, it would be difficult to straighten them out. In face of his overwhelming force, he could just use his power to destroy any idea of building a resistance. But even so, in just 1 or 2 years, all the other nobles will already have forgotten the loser's name. The same will happen to Duke Ryan. But during this period of 2 years, it's absolutely impossible to transform Border Town into such a big city like Longsong Stronghold. His Royal Highness must have a deeper intention. That's good to hear. Then the city. I am willing to act as your representative, Your Highness, blurted Petrov out, but not much later his expression became hesitant once again. But, King, no, I mean your brother does not necessarily agree with this result. In case he assigns a new duke to this territory, I won't be able to fight against the king. There is no need for you to fear a confrontation, Roland said and threw 2 letters in front of him. Look at this documents I'd found in the former Duke Ryan's study. When Petrov quickly swept his gaze over the content of the letters, he couldn't help to gasp in shock. The first letter looked like was sent to the Duke by a spy. It seems like the new king and the Queen of Clearwater have fought a big battle in and close to Eagle City, and the result ended up as a major loss for the king? The second letter was even more horrifying. Even so, it was only half written. It was still clear that Duke Ryan wanted to annex the north. The idea of becoming independence was clearly revealed. The letter wasn't finished and it was furthermore unknown to whom he wanted to send it. But Petrov still understood immediately what His Highness wanted to tell him. There was no need for him to resist because the new king had already enough problems on his own. Otherwise, the Duke would have never dared to declare his independence. With his elite knights, he was already invincible in the Western Territory, the only difference to the king's knights laid in their numbers. The secret letter could have been forged, but the second parchment was indeed written with Osman Ryan's handwriting, so unless the prince found a witch that could mimic the writing of others. For a short moment, he thought about this possibility only to immediately dismiss this speculation again. The prince had no reason to try to deceive him. Implementing someone as his representative wasn't one-sided. If his representative was unable to rule over the stronghold, the prince would also not profit from the deal. Moreover, every duke assigned by King Timothy would become an enemy of the prince. If he wanted for House Honeysuckle to stay above the other four noble families, he had to rely on the support of the prince, and on the other hand, in order to ensure that everything was handled in his interest, the prince would also have to make sure that the whole family wouldn't get challenged. When he had thought everything through, Petrov slowly stood up and bowed towards Roland. "The whole family is willing to serve you." "Well," the latter nodded, "but it's not up to you to decide. I'll have to ask you some questions first." "Your Highness, please. What are you going to do with those who are against you? How much do you estimate the monthly tax revenue will be? Also, how would you guarantee that you can pay 1,000 points each month? In the case that I request you to vigorously expand the trade and commerce sector, what would you do?" Petrov had thought that His Highness would take this opportunity to gather as much information about the other lords of the Western Territory. He had never expected that the other side would ask such weird questions. In the end, this were almost all only questions about his policy, means, and his general business knowledge. After having all of these questions asked of him, Petrov put his mind into answering them one after another. Along with his answers, His Highness' expression also became more and more satisfied. Finally, the prince clapped his hands and said, "Well, that will be enough for today. When you have calculated how to redeem the value of 3,000 points, you can come back and free your father. Rest assured, during these days I will properly entertain him. Your Highness, that representative will be announced another day." Roland gave one of his knights the signal to see him out. When Petrov left the hall, he had much to think about. He got his god stone of retaliation back from Carter. It was still the same brightly shining blue stone. It seems the value of 50 gold royals wasn't much. Asterisk. What can you tell me? Roland turned his view to Nightingale, who stand beside him. "Oh, basically everything he said was the truth," she shrugged. "He was much more sincere than the several ladies and gentlemen you have previously talked to. That said, is it right to tell everyone the same story? Furthermore, showing them those letters, all of them are confidential." "Not to everyone." The prince looked down at the list in his hands. "They were all from the 5 noble families. Only those big nobles are suitable to manage Longsong stronghold in my stead. If their power is not strong enough, even if I was to give them this position, they wouldn't be able to run this stronghold. In the end, there would only be a lot of infighting. As for the news that Timothy Wimbledon was defeated by Eagle City, that's not really a secret, so to say. Sooner or later the news would spread through the whole kingdom of Grey Castle. For me it's even better that it spreads a little faster. But the content of this news was just perfect for me," he thought. "If the second prince wasn't defeated, I'm afraid that I would have to spend a lot of time to hold him back, and even if he tried to use force, the results may not have been so beautiful. So, will you choose him?" "If nothing else happens," Roland said with a smile. He was the first one who took the initiative to ask by himself. The subjective initiative has always been the most important quality of the employees. Furthermore, I would never expected that there would be someone within the 5 families who is so well versed in the field of administration and trade. I have thought that they would only know how to ride and kill." When he found the name of Petrov Hull on the list, he gently scratched a circle around him.